Many of us who claim to study the world, like economists, sociologists, anthropologists, are not so much studying some abstract thing out there called the world. They're studying people. People are complex, shaped differently by nature and nurture, buffeted by emotions in ways they themselves cannot understand, mostly beyond rationality, and using language in subtle ways that others can't often fully understand. And yet, any field of study has to, by force, simplify what it is studying, for that is the first step to understanding. The first step, and often the last step. Academic fields that were born out of that primal and essential urge called curiosity can often become slave to dogmas and methodology that miss the central point. In fact, this has happened. And for the sake of curiosity, for the sake of knowledge and truth, for the sake of humanity itself, we must fight this. We must fight this with every breath we have. But occasionally, we can take a break and save our breaths for other worthy endeavors, such as, well, singing. In the end, there will be singing. Yes, there will be singing.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Biju Raos, better known to his friends and fellow economists as Biju Raos. Biju is a lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank. And while you may hear that designation and imagine his work must be boring and conventional, think again. Biju is a passionate iconoclast who rails against the fashions of his profession. He laments that economists and anthropologists and sociologists no longer talk to one another. He feels that while data is important, so are human stories. And we must not forget the people who might appear from a distance to just be numbers but are so much more than that. Biju began his career with radical papers on dowry and domestic violence. An early paper on dowry has a title I love, The Rising Price of Husbands. And his recent work spans disciplines and goes close to the heart of Indian democracy. He is also a student of Hindustani classical, and his singing at the end of this episode is magical. So if you listen to this conversation on double speed, please slow down when you reach the music. I recorded this episode during a recent trip to Washington, D.C., where Biju lives and works. We were so close to the center of global power, and yet Biju's concerns could hardly be further away. This is one of my favorite episodes. This was the first time I met Biju, and I loved hanging out with him, and so will you. But before we begin, let's take a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Biju, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit. Pleasure to be here.
So we're recording this at the Mercator Center in Arlington, and while you were very kindly driving me here, you mentioned that, the World Bank's loss could have been cinema's gain, and that once upon a time you wanted to, join the Film Institute, and you thought of directing things, which actually, looking at your work, doesn't surprise me at all, because your work shows a deep engagement with society and what's actually happening in human stories and all of that. But tell me a little bit about this side of you, these passions of yours, because the other thing that I'll also double click on and deep dive into is your love for classical music, to the extent that in your mid-40s you actually started learning again.
Yes.
And are extremely serious about it. So I want to know about this side of you first, the movie side,
Absolutely.
The music side.
Firstly, it's a pleasure to come and talk to you. I've been a fan for many years. No, but the film thing started because my aunt was an actress. Her name was L.V. Sharda Rao, and she acted in Girish Karnad's first movie, Vamshariksha. She was the heroine of that movie, for which she won a national award and all that. So in that process, and I was very young, it was, I think 72, so I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I was introduced to that world because I had to go, watch her, and then she acted in all these Kannada movies that did quite well. And in the process, I met all the greats, who were involved with that movie, B.V. Karanth, Girish Karnad, that lot. And I'm told that Girish Karnad saw me running around, and he said, I want him for my next movie, which was Kadu. He wanted me to play the young boy there. But then, there were two problems. I shot up in height very quickly. And secondly, my Kannada wasn't that great, so that didn't happen. But that sparked a germ in me. So I've always had this great fascination for Indian cinema and for particularly in those days, art cinema. And when I was in college, I was part of the film club, and we used to organize film showings and stuff. And I used to belong to that circle of friends. My classmates included people like Shehnaaz Patel, Farah Khan, that crowd. So I used to hang out with them. I haven't lost touch, unfortunately, and I used to act. So I was very, very serious. And in fact, I remember speaking to a gentleman whose name, unfortunately, I've forgotten, who had got his economics in the US and then become a filmmaker. And he was telling me, you will regret becoming an economist, you should become a filmmaker. I remember sitting with him in some restaurant and he was advising me. But then I think what happened was, I come from a long line of economists. So my father and my granduncle, others really influenced my decision to go in the other direction. Also, there were family issues at home. So my parents got divorced when I was 11, so I had to take care of my mother. And consequently, I sort of felt that this was the safer option. So I went in that direction. Yeah.
And when we were in the car, when you told me this, I told you about another friend of mine who, runs a bank but was deeply into cinema in a similar way and almost went in, but then he said that, no, I've got a cushy life, and now he's super successful and just wants to continue doing that. But one thing he complains to me about is that he says, whenever I go out with other people in the CXO suite, the conversations are incredibly boring because it will only be cricket or Bollywood or very cliched things, and they don't read books, they don't watch movies, they don't listen to music. There's no widening there. It's like they're all on a track, and it's so frustrating, and very much painting himself as an outlier, which I believe to be the case. How is that in the profession that you are in, for example? Like, one, is it the case that many people are too narrow and don't have these wide-ranging interests that are important for making you a more rounded person and a better thinker? Is that kind of the case? And like in your case, how important are all of these other sort of interests?
So the other interests are central to my life. And from the beginning, from the time I was an undergrad and then, of course, going to get my PhD, I've always hung out with non-economists as well as economists. And, expanded my horizons that way and broadened my reading that way. And I continue to do it. My job is in the research department of the World Bank, but I'm also part of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which is a collection of philosophers and political scientists and sociologists and psychologists and so on. So I love that. I once described it as if the economics is the rhythm, that's the melody. And so I wouldn't do it any other way. So I consciously try. I actually don't even try very much. It happens naturally and organically to have circles of friends, acquaintances, people I can debate with on all sides, and music, of course.
Tell me about the musical journey. What often happens in life is when we are young, when we want to do something with the aim of achieving something and not for its own sake, right? That if you want to be a filmmaker, you will dream of making films that, in your case, because you're into art cinema, I guess winning at Cannes and Venice rather than the Oscars. But you have those sort of goals that I will do this, I will do that. And then as you grow older, I think some of us on that journey figure out that the goals and shit don't really matter. It's a joy of doing something and just immersing into it that is the whole big deal. And in your arc, what I found really interesting is that in your mid-40s you start learning Hindustani classical music. You learn it very seriously. You find one guru for Drupad, then you find another guru, Pandit Rashekar Mansoor, in 2013, and there is almost a sort of a devotion to that, which I find really beautiful because it's not goal directed in terms of achieving some particular thing. You just love it, you're immersing, you're kind of getting better. So tell me more about that aspect of life. Like, why did you come back to Hindustani classical so late in life? And, how do you, when you think of your own self-actualization or self-fulfillment, it is obviously clearly not in terms of just your job, important as that work is. So, how do you think about these things?
No, thanks. So my interest in music goes back to my early childhood. Both my parents were very much interested in it. My mother studied sitar with one of Ravi Shankar's students for a little bit. And she had a lot of musician friends. So I remember as a child, I must have been 6 or 7, visiting Pandit Ramnarayan's house and him showing me how to play the sarangi. And I realized it was too difficult for me, so I ran away. So, that kind of thing, that's how I grew up. Then in college, I went to St. Xavier's College in Bombay, and there was something called the Indian Music Group. And of course, my classmates were Tawfiq Qureshi and Fazal Qureshi and all these guys. So I was in that world, in addition to the film classmates. And we used to organize concerts, we used to hang out with music people. And they had this lovely music room full of recordings, and of course the concerts. So it's been a long-standing interest and always been a bit of a regret that I never took that seriously. So actually, I started training first when I went to Chicago as a postdoc in 1990. That was my first job at the University of Chicago. And there was a wonderful man there, he's still there, Dr. Tapan Bhattacharya, who was from the Patiala Gharana. So I started taking lessons with him for a couple of years, for the 2 years that I was there. So that's where it started. Then it ended because, I just didn't have any time to practice and all that. Around 2007, my first marriage ended. So it was part of the healing process. I said, I've got to start taking this seriously. I started hunting for a teacher. And then I met Shubha Shankaran, who's a very dear friend, still remains a very dear friend. And she was Ustad Imrad Khan's student. And then she's a Surbahar player. And then she started studying Dhrupad and became a Drupadiya. So I started studying with her very seriously. And the thing with her is, she had her previous life, in addition to being a musician, she was a computer programmer and a computer engineer, and she worked for digital and so on. So very precise person. I'm not at all a precise person. So her sense of teaching was basically first to get your sur right, and that constantly, and every time she heard a little bit of variation, Biju, you're going off there, come back here, come back. That sort of really got to me, and I found it extremely healing in that time. It was a tough time. Then around 2012, I think, my cousin Usha, who was a student of Pandit Rajshekhar Mansoor, introduced me to him. And somehow, luckily, knowing, I was already, no spring chicken, he said, okay, come and study with me. So every time I was in Bangalore, I would go morning, evening, study with him. And that continued from 2012 till just before the pandemic, so around 2019. I was looking at my music notes, and the last lesson was 2019. And then the pandemic stopped, and he died at the end of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we lost him. So it's not one of those things. The journey is about, I love Hindustani music. I adore it. Carnatic music also, but I know less about Carnatic. But Hindustani music for me is, I listen maybe 2-3 hours a day while I'm working and all that. So it was a way of entering to me. And I remember when I was in St. Xavier's, we used to have something called Malhar, which was this music concerts, around Republic Day. And every year Mallikarjun Mansoor came. And Rajshekhar Mansoor was his sangat. He came with him. So I was introduced to my guru then, as an audience member. And I went with my friend Aditya Goenka for the first time. We saw Mallikarjun Mansoor. Aditya is a professor at the University of Birmingham. And I was talking to him about it recently. He comes on stage and he opens his mouth and you're in a different universe. You're just transported somewhere else, and it's like, what's happening to me? Because this Jaipur Atroli Gharana, which he had Mallikarjun Mansoor himself, his sur is so perfect. He pulls you in, and then he's like a method actor. He's a different person with every raga, and his sense of rhythm is extraordinary. So everything comes together. There was nothing like it, So I was hooked from that time on. And of course, all the greats used to come to Bombay in those days. They're all past now. It's just, the senior Dagar brothers, the one of them was still alive. The other one had passed away. Of course, Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar Khan, all the great ones were there, whoever was around, M.S. Subbulakshmi, and that really got to me in a big way. And that's when I really got hooked. So it's been a part of my life, at least as a listener. To me, studying music is not about being a performer. It's about getting to be a better listener, and now I'm 60 years old. I find that I've listened to things that are now long gone memories. They're just recordings, and I used to have these Buzurg log. I used to know who used to listen to the great ones, Amir Khan, or all these people who I never met, right? So I think that So it's been it is a very important part of my life.
You wrote an essay on Pandit Mansoor and also a moving obituary in Scroll. And in that obituary, you mentioned that the first time you went to meet him, he said that, look, I'll take you, but my condition is that you got to do every single thing I tell you. You got to follow the process and all of that. And I was struck by how there is a life lesson for learning in that also. That when you learn something, you have to, in a sense, devote yourself to the craft unquestioningly. And later, the beautiful stuff that happens later, happens afterwards. But initially you have to just put yourself through those paces, even if it seems like drudgery or boring at times and whatever. So what do you think of that? Like, what was your experience during that learning process? And am I overthinking it when I say that as a metaphor that can apply to anything you learn anywhere?
Yes and no. I mean, so Rajshekhar Mansoor never taught ABC stuff. Yes, he assumed that you would know the basics.
And you knew Drupad when you went to him?
No, Drupad is nowhere near that. But
I
could sing. I mean, I knew Saregama and all that, right? What he basically said was, look, I mean, he didn't say this, he implicitly implied, the reason I'm teaching people like you, because you don't want to be professional musicians. So you're going to listen to whatever I say, What he was obsessed with was the gharana. Because he felt that the dilution of gharanas was a terrible thing. I mean, I agree and disagree with him, but he felt very strongly about that. And his gharana was Jaipur Athroli. And so he wanted to be sure that everybody he taught was dedicated to preserving that gharana. Yeah. And that gharana basically is different from the other gharanas in its utter and complete reliance on the bandish as the core of where you go from. You don't learn the raga first and then the bandish. You learn the raga through the bandish. It's that way. It's like Carnatic music, and then of course the elaboration, the improvisation, the upaj as they call it, all of that happens via the bandish. So he actually also told all of his students, not just me, that while we were studying with him, we couldn't listen to any other gharana.
Wow.
So I was allowed to listen to Kesar Bhai, I was allowed to listen to, Mogubai Kurdikar, I was allowed to Mallikarjun Mansoor, of course, but I could not listen to Kishori.
Wow.
Because he felt she had gone away from the gharana. Yeah. So, and he tells a story about how Mogubai Kurdikar, Kishori's mother and guru, asked Mallikarjun Mansoor to talk to her daughter when she went off and became a rebel. He said, please bring her back, look at what she's doing. So, and he gave that as an example of how even her own mother thought she had deviated from the gharana. So wow. God knows if that's true. I'm sure it's true. But so that was his thing. Stick within the gharana. And there is a lesson there, which is necessary for somebody like me who's a wanderer. I have a very short attention span. I go everywhere. So for me, it was immense training to be stuck there. I didn't start listening again to other musicians till he passed, actually. And then now, of course, I listen to everything again. But that particular period, that's getting steeped in that is one of those. I mean, I wouldn't have. I mean, it's a part of my life that is very important to me. That period particularly.
And I wonder if there's an analog there with the other part of your life. Like, for example, if you're, I think the steeping in the gharana is super important to really understand it and to know it inside out. But it's also important to let other winds blow in, as it were, and listen to other stuff. And I wonder if that can also apply to the social sciences. Like, among your papers, the one I most enjoyed reading, and I just think it's a masterpiece, is your 2022 paper, Can Economics Become More Reflexive? Where the argument you make is that, look, there was a time where these weren't separate social sciences. You've referred to Charles Booth making the poverty maps of London a century and a half ago. And it's there's qualitative stuff, there's quantitative stuff, there's data, there is what would be called anecdote, or you could also talk of them as human stories, and all of it is creating this rich tapestry of understanding. And the central case that you are making is that after that we've gone into all of these different silos, that sociology is become one thing, economics has become one thing with a disregard for the qualitative and putting the quantitative on a pedestal. Anthropology has gone in different directions, and it often seems that these don't even speak to each other. So does that same gharana metaphor work, that to get methodological rigor it is important to have training in one of these, but to really make something out of that, you should open yourself up and let the others?
In my social science work, I think that's absolutely right. But in my music work, my Guruji wouldn't like that metaphor. But I do. So Yes, thank you for mentioning that paper. That actually is my favorite paper that I've ever written. My wife tells me I always struggle with writing. It takes me a long time. I get distracted. That one I apparently sat and banged out. I don't even remember writing it. I just sat and banged it out in 1 week. My friend Ashwini Deshpande, who she was editing a book and she wanted me to write something along these lines. So I just banged it out. It just came out of me. So coming to that subject, around the 1920s, right, 1930s is when the serious divergence between the disciplines really starts, becoming very strict. And in economics, particularly after the Second World War, with the coming of people like Paul Samuelson, Kenneth Arrow, all of whom were wonderfully broadly read people. That's the interesting thing to remember. The two great economists that we can think of at that time were Kenneth Arrow and Paul Samuelson. And if you actually read their writing, they're very broadly read. But they were also brilliant mathematicians. So they brought that into economics, that mathematizing of economics. Particularly, Samuelson wrote a book called The Foundations of Economic Analysis, which revolutionized economics in showing that economics could be done really well with calculus. Now, there were people like Jevons who did that before that, but he really put that on, made it fashionable. What happened with that? And then, of course, Keynes, who never mathematized anything he wrote. He was very good at math. He wrote a book on the probability theory. He knew his math, but he never did that. He never went that direction. But his sort of successors, Lawrence Klein, a bunch of people, Paul Samuelson himself, started mathematizing Keynes. And then that became the way you did economics. And I think I have no problem with that. I've done some of that myself. But when that becomes the only way you did it, that's when the problems start. Yeah, we're sitting in the Mercator Center, which I think is still old-fashioned in that way. It sort of mixes things. And I was deeply influenced by my granduncle, who was a student of Keynes. He is one of my gurus. And he always said, he objected to this. So anyway, so that has stayed with me throughout my career. And, it's been an interesting journey in the sense that I work, one of my co-authors is a fellow called M.R. Sharan, who he's written a beautiful book anyway. That's another story. And when we work together on Zoom, we meet every week. I once said, I'm not an economist. And he got very mad at me. Of course you're an economist, but I don't think of myself as an economist. I think of myself as a social scientist, mainly because I feel a bit rejected by economics, in the sense that, I don't want to make this sound too grand, but it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle to persuade economists, even in my own department, that I'm a serious economist because I do this kind of stuff, that deviation. That's the problem. You get. It's not punishment is too strong or whatever. I have a good job. All that is not the problem. It is the perception that economics is this. The application, in the old days, particularly less so now, the application of mathematical theory with quantitative data. That is slowly changing now because of behavioral economics, because of Texas data work, but it's still, dominant in the discipline. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's that I've always rebelled against that, because I think it is just empirically wrong. It just doesn't make sense to me. If our job is to understand societies, understand politics, understand human behavior, to try to find ways of making people better off or making societies better off, how can we think that there's only one narrow way of doing that? Makes no sense to me, right? And so that logic, unfortunately, I think a lot of people share that logic in economics, but they're constrained by needing to make a career in that discipline. And so when they deviate, they get punished.
Yeah, no, that's very resonant, and it strikes me that, I just sort of the blind man and the elephant, and it is like, the economist will see only the trunk, the sociologist will see only the tail, and there is a great danger in saying this is all there is. And you can become the world's best expert in, elephant trunks, but that doesn't mean you know the elephant. And I'm interested in the why of this. Like, looking at just human behavior, in fact, through the lens of economics, through trying to understand incentives, why has these shifts taken place in each of these social sciences? Like, is it that once you get systematized into something that is taught in a university, that is part of academia, then all the incentives force you to conform to one particular dominant fashion to the extent that other fashions completely disappear, and that, like econometrics took over economics, that one becomes a dominant strain, and soon, the past is washed away, and there's a homogenization, there's a flattening sound, and that's all there is. Is that what happened? What is a why?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't think there's one why. There are a couple of different whys. Let me talk about economics. I know less about the other disciplines. I mean, if I talk, I'll be talking as a lay consumer. So let me talk about the discipline I know. In economics, it's basically physics anyway, and it's kind of sitting there saying, we want to be a science. We're not just a social science. Social science is somehow lesser than science. So we want to be science. How do we know how to do science? I mean, and those were the days of the Manhattan Project and all that, So coming from World War II, all these Oppenheimer and all these guys have become, the big gurus, Einstein. We want to be like them. So we are just as good as mathematics, the economists who started all of this. So let's start introducing that in economics, make it more scientific. That is then turns into a Nobel Prize of Economics, or rather the Swedish, Memorial Prize in Economics, Swedish Bank Memorial Prize in Economics, whatever you want to call it. I think that's been not a good thing because it has reified that way of thinking. And if you look at the rationale for the Nobel Prize in Economics when it first came in 1972 or whatever, it is basically because this is the most scientific of the social sciences. Yeah.
Wow.
So that then awards these prizes with a few exceptions, Gunnar Myrdal, Hayek, there are some exceptions. But they award it to people who have mathematized economics. Arrow, De Broglie, Samuelson, all of them being amongst them. And what then happens is that that starts dominating the editorial boards of academic journals. That starts filtering into what you're taught in class. For instance, the history of economic thought stopped being taught in most economics departments about 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Yeah. So when I got my PhD, there was no history of economic thought. Yeah. And which I think is a mistake. I mean, I got history of economic thought as an undergrad because I went to St. Xavier's College, Bombay University. We got this, but for the most part, most economists I know, again, with the exception of people in the Mercator Center where we sit, don't know much about the history of thought. Yeah. So you don't even know why you're doing what you're doing. This is the way we do it. This is the science. And of course, the latest version of that, which I think Lan talked about with you, is this business of trying to become like public health. Everything becomes a randomized control trial. Everything becomes a behavioral experiment because you're obsessed. Economists have for a long time been obsessed with causality. So that becomes a thing. You have to start looking for stupid old metaphor for whatever's under your light because that's what you can identify really well. Which basically means that is almost like a hegemonizing thing. It's a hegemonizing logic. And as Kuhn said, it's a paradigm, and you cannot break that because even if you want to, you get deeply punished. I know several people who, like me, were, trying to deviate away and couldn't find jobs. They'd go into other things. They quit economics after the first year because they can't stand it. I have a wonderful friend, Nepali guy called Pratyush Onta. He also started his PhD in economics in my department. He was 3-4 years younger than me. And after the first year, he gave up. He said, what is this? I don't want to study this stuff. He went to history, got his PhD. He's now one of Nepal's leading intellectuals. A tremendous guy. Yeah. But he wanted to study economics. He quit. And there are many people like that. Yeah. Not as successful as Pratyush in that alternate career, but there are many people like that. So that, I think, is sort of the reason. It's the logic of a profession. It's the logic of a paradigm that is then professionalized. Yeah. Which makes it difficult to deviate and then attracts people like that. So people attracted to economics were those who were good at mathematics. Your GRE score in mathematics had to be at 99 percentile, so you're not going to get into top economics department. So that's the person that attracts. Yeah, it doesn't attract somebody who may be more sociologically oriented. Now that's, again, I think we're reaching a point when that's slowly changing because of these sort of new developments. But it has been the case for the last, since the 70, 80 years.
And what is the cost of this? Like one beautiful sentence in that paper of yours, which I think is a masterpiece everyone should read because it's so clearly written. It's not like an academic paper. But one quote I picked up from there which really spoke to me was, the methods lead the questions, where you're making the point that if you restrict yourself to one method of inquiry, you can only ask a set of questions that lend themselves to that method of inquiry. And therefore, I would think that, the pursuit of truth, all of these fields emerged in the pursuit of truth because, give you different ways of arriving at it. But if you restrict yourself to one particular sort of method of arriving at the truth, then you are asking questions that are more and more constrained, and it really becomes difficult to get a sort of a holistic understanding.
Yeah, I'm absolutely right. I mean, again, cliche. It's the tail wagging the dog, right? I mean, you sit there. so concerned about making a career, which is normal. We all have to make a career. We have to make livings. But making a career means you cannot go somewhere else. It's still to this day that I work with a lot of young people, and I have to keep, when I talk to them, I sort of, let's go in that direction. And then I have to check myself. Hey, they're not me, They're starting their careers. I can't push them. And I've been accused, by the way. I have been accused. I'll never forget this. A very famous Indian economist, woman economist, told two people who worked with me, don't work with Biju. He will take you along the wrong path and you won't get a job. Okay. And I'm not going to mention names, but this has happened. Yeah. And she's right. This famous economist is actually right, because it will harm them by doing what I do, because they will not be able to find jobs. Because you have to, in order to find a job as a good economist, you have to show that you're capable of doing all these methods, and you have to flash your stuff, as it were, right? And so a ballet dancer, the Bharatanatyam dancer has to do Nrita. They have to go really fast, Kathak dancer, right? The same thing. You have to show your technique is fantastic. What happens in that process is a whole bunch of interesting questions don't get asked. And they cannot get asked with those methods, right? And because you cannot deviate from that set of methods, Kaushik Basu made this point interestingly a long time ago, where he said that a lot of important issues don't come into economics because we have to be we're so concerned with modeling everything. Yeah. Norms, ethics, basic stuff, right? Amartya Sen, famously made a point in something he wrote, I don't remember when, but he made the following point, that is that core a philosopher? And he says something along these lines, I'm paraphrasing. And he said, but I knew that I had to show people that I was a good economist. So I had to do both. So he said, the only reason I'm taking seriously in many ways is because I've proved myself that I can do math better than anybody else. Yeah, and I've made fundamental contributions in economics. You look at his Nobel Prize citation, none of his philosophy stuff comes in. It's all his economics, social choice theory, all this stuff is what he won the Nobel Prize for, not for his philosophy, right? Which is what he's known for now. So that then he was able to manage a career by doing both and becoming a great proponent and exponent of both types of thing. That's rare. That's very rare. And it takes a genius like Sen to be able to pull that off. But that, again, affects the questions we ask. For obvious reasons, right? And I think the problem I have is, in some ways, who cares about where a discipline goes or doesn't go? It's the influence economics has on all our lives, on policy. That's where I start getting really, really worried. I sit at the World Bank and you see every economics fad affecting every policy decision. So I've been there long enough to now see 3 economics fads go past. Structural adjustment in the old days. Then they came and they started all this RCT stuff, and the RCT stuff has taken over. So what is evidence-based now? It's only if it passes the test of an RCT is that good evidence. Otherwise, it's not good evidence. You get tired of this, right? The fads affecting people's lives because the obviousness, and nobody's saying these are not good methods, shouldn't be done. Open your mind up. There are other things also. Nobody's saying that these are bad methods. But for me, the way I disagree with Lant is I don't think RCTs are evil in themselves. I think they are a method. It's like the standard tooling in any social science is a regression. It's a neutral thing. It's how you use it, what you do with it. So that dominance of the method over the question then affects people's lives. That's where I start really, really getting worried. Yeah.
I think Land's fundamental objection, which I agree with, is that if one way of thinking crowds out other ways, like kinky development as he calls it, crowds out other ways of thinking, there's a danger there. I don't think per se that he would say there's anything wrong with them, but they shouldn't be the whole pie, as it were.
That I 100% agree with, yeah. And Lant in his writing is a lot more stringent on that point. There is a point to be made that prior to RCTs, economists were still obsessed with causality, but they would do causality badly. So actually, I need to make that point because it's very important. So you would, run some sort of regression with national level data and you make these big grand claims over something or the other. I could run another regression with the same data, get completely the opposite result. You cannot make causal claims when you cannot show causality properly. So if you want to make causal claims, you have to follow these methods. Only point I'm making is, why be obsessed with causal claims? A basic description is sometimes extremely rich, teaches us a lot. Following a process, nothing causal about it, just watching how things happen. That's important. Yeah. So what the method did in econometrics, the obsession with causality, is that it took us away from asking questions about description, about process, about, and also, as I say in that reflexivism paper, connecting with the people we call subjects. That word, again, is the problem. It's a word in economics and psychology. Those are the people we study. They are down there somewhere. We are the great gods, studying them like some Greek gods. We are not. We have to go to what we're trying to study and build it from there. Ask questions that are important on the ground. And of course, the greatest exponent of that, in my view, is Jean Drèze. And who that's how he does for a living. And he's a good economist too. So it can happen.
I want to double click on something else that you mentioned, because it's something that I think about a bit. Like, I agree with you that Amartya Sen is a great philosopher. That's a fundamental way I think of him more than his economics. And if you think of philosophy, when you study philosophy, you do study the history of philosophy. That's the first damn thing you do, because it is important, because the world is complex, because nothing is settled, and you go in with that humility, and therefore you have to sort of study it all. And philosophers, in a sense, are proto-scientists or they are asking the questions first. And I think there is value to anyone engaged in any kind of inquiry as thinking of themselves as fundamentally first a philosopher, and then everything flows from there. And I guess all of these people we would think of as Renaissance men or Renaissance women, like Arrow and Samuelson, who you mentioned, like Keynes himself, had wide-ranging interests, and they brought it all to bear on the way they saw the world. And are there fewer of them? Because obviously there's a selection effect that if I look back on the past, I'll obviously see the guys who were. And when I look around me today, I'll see the vast swaths of mediocrity. But what is your sense that does the system disincentivize you from wide-ranging interests? Like, for example, and again, an orthogonal question, I think about how we are shaped into what we do. And when you talk about your students, that you now worry about taking them in a wrong direction, that wrong is from a perspective of whether they live a goal-directed life where the goal is to get ahead in the profession. But if their goal is to, be better thinkers, understand the world better, then your direction is absolutely right. But if it is to rise in that particular career game, the academic circle jerk, then it is wrong. So how do we think of the shaping of the self? Like, are there people who are naturally inclined to becoming Renaissance people, or is it that the system sets powerful incentives in place so we will have less of them?
It's the incentives. It's the incentives, and then the selection that comes from those incentives. In other words, if the incentives are structured some way, you're going to find people who are good at those incentives entering that system, right? So that's a basic story. The best economists to this day are those who are widely read. And I can think of many. I just mentioned a few, but there's so many. Debraj Ray, Kaushik Basu, people who are Indians, but, Daron Ashimoglu, all these are Jim Robinson. These are all very widely read people. They're brilliant people, Timur Kuran. There are many, many people like that. But in their academic expression, they have to be extremely strict, because otherwise they will not get published. You see, so till they reach 70 and they finish that journey. Otherwise, in order to make that career, you have to publish a certain way. You have to show that you are very good at what you do. So that's entirely structured by incentives. And those incentives are not set by some grand figure or something. It is how a discipline evolves to a certain point. My sense is that economics is slowly changing now. Yeah. For two reasons. One is that there are new methods that have come in, the analysis of text data, which opens up, for instance, now top economists in top places have started analyzing text data. So in macroeconomics, for instance, they're looking at Schiller gave a presidential address on narrative economics and wrote a book on that subject. That's slowly coming in, which I think is enormously healthy. I wish it was everywhere. It's only in macro right now. Hopefully it'll come other places. Of course, behavioral economics and psychology, which has its own set of problems we can talk about, I think. But that has changed because there were certain people who are able to bring in, say, in psychology, be psychologists, but do it within economics and show economists the value of that, right? So that will slowly change, but it's not quite a paradigm shift. It's a movement from the core of what a discipline is to something else. Again, I want to reiterate this. None of this would matter. Who cares about where economics goes? It's the effect it has on policy that at the end really bothers me. Yeah. So, and why should policy, particularly policy in development, that's what we care about, right? Why should that be so deeply affected by the trajectory of the economics profession? Let it go on its journey. That's its journey. Why should that affect policy? That, to me, is the dangerous part.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One rant I keep going about on my podcast is that Many people think that, oh, economics is just about numbers and graphs and who really cares and why does the GDP matter? And I keep trying to make that connection that economics has a humanitarian impact. Bad policies on scale can ravage lives and the other way around. And that's why they sort of matter so much. We'll come back to all of this, including to this paper, but let's go back to your life. Okay. Tell me about your childhood. Where did you grow up? What were your early years like? What was a mahal at home, as it were?
So I was born in Bangalore, but that's because my mother came to Bangalore to give birth. But I'm really a Bombay kid. And my father worked for Hindustan Lever and all those companies in Bombay. So we lived there. My father he's very much with us. He's 89 years old. Was one of the early batches from the Delhi School of Economics. His father was a stenographer in the Bombay High Court. So he really was the guy who made it out. Yeah. And one of the reasons he did it was because of my grandmother. His mother's brother was V.K.R.B. Rao, who was the doyen of Indian economists. He was a great inspiration to my father. So my father always, and because came from a poor family, he couldn't get his PhD. He decided not to do that. He got admission to Harvard and all that, but he said, no, I have to be here and I have to make a living. So he did that. My mother, her father was a completely self-made man. He ran away from home when he was 12 and went, this is all mythology a little bit, but who knows? I think some of it is true. He apparently stowed away on a ship to Aden and then to Shanghai when he was 14 or something, and then learned the stockbroking business from there. Never went to school, never finished. Came back to Bangalore and started the first stockbroking business in South India called Lokur and Company. One of the first. I don't know if it's the first, one of the first, called Lokur and Company. That was I think he starts in 1922, 23 or something. And he became very well off. And, used to drive all these fancy foreign cars. He had a big house. And then, of course, the freedom movement came along and he gives up everything to the cause. And so 1942, I've got he has a copy of the Economics of Khadi by Gandhiji. And I've got his notated version of that. And the chapter on trusteeship, he goes on and on, keeps underlining. So that was what he did with his wealth. He gave it all away. Basically, he died bankrupt in 1972. So my mother grew up as a bit of a princess in that world, plus with ideals. One thing my mother did not know how to do very well was to keep house. She wasn't. My dad came from a very middle-class background and, expected certain things. And because of the gender inequality. So they got divorced when I was 11. And that was a huge thing for me. I was sent to boarding school when I was 9, luckily to a place called Rishi Valley, where I was exposed to J Krishnamurti, who's had a profound influence on my life, as he has on anybody who's encountered him. But I think the marking moment for me was my mother, after she got divorced, she came back to her father's house. Her father dies a year later. So there are financial constraints. And consequently, she becomes a divorcee, as it's said back in the 70s. It was 1975. All this happened. She comes to Bangalore in 74. 74, later in the year, my grandfather dies. So she then struggles like crazy. And she had a very sort of vital but volatile personality, right? But she sort of slowly starts going over the edge. And she was all this diagnosis came later, but she became schizophrenic, basically, right? And as schizophrenics do, alienated a lot of people around her because that's the nature of the disease. So, and then because of that divorce, because of other things, I started doing very badly in school. So my father got worried and he said, Rishi Valley is not the place. Rishi Valley is do what you want kind of place. You would go and you would watch the sunset every evening. Where the thing called Astachal, beautiful thing. The classes would be held outside. If you didn't want to go, you did have to go. It was really lovely. And my father felt that wasn't for me. So he sent me to a military school called Sanar near Simla, which was the worst experience of my life. It was absolutely horrible. 2 reasons. I was the darkest kid in class.
Wow.
And secondly, I was not a sportsman, I was no good at these things. I was different. And there was a very famous now a famous movie star called Sanjay Dutt, who you might have heard of, who was my senior. And he bullied the heck out of me.
Oh.
Right? Every time I see Sanjay Dutt, I gag. I remember this guy as the bully. Yeah. So, I saw that Munna Bhai and all that. I said, this is Sanjay Dutt. You don't know the real Sanjay Dutt. Anyway, so there was a lot of bullying. There was a lot of violence. And I was going through a very, very tough time. Thankfully, there were a couple of lovely teachers. Manjari Khan was one of them, who really noticed this and took me on, and which was really lovely. Matthew Parel, two people I'll never forget. And so, I guess I've grown up with this thing. And my mother essentially struggled with money as well, right? And so it was always been in my head that I need to make enough money to take care of her. So that then leads to my college, where I went to Xavier's, which was the most beautiful experience of my life, because I went to this place that was totally opening again. I mean, I never went to class for economics, but I read everything, and they encouraged me to read everything. And, and they didn't seem to mind. I got 49% in my first year, 49% in my second year. And then for some reason, my teacher, Professor Nadkarni, nominates me for the best student of the college award.
My God.
So that's what the principal said. My God, what are you doing? How can you give it to this guy? Because third year results hadn't come. And somehow, that happened. And I was saying, okay, I'm being myself. I was watching movies, I was going to music, all this. And I just felt the confidence came back. But then, always this business of trying to be free in how you think, but needing to do it practically because of the need to make enough money to take care of my mother. Because as a schizophrenic, as it happened later, I'm glad I went that way, because there was a fair amount of money needed for the care, she had to live alone, all those things. So that disciplined me, I think. If that discipline wasn't there, I don't know what would have happened. I would have certainly joined films. There's no question about it. So that shaped me a lot. I mean, I without getting into great details, that's sort of the basic gist of my childhood. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania after Xavier's for my PhD, which, opened up this different world and I was no good at mathematics, even though I was okay in my GRE, obviously, because I got in, but I didn't know all the math that they needed. So I had to sit and go from, one consequence of going to Sanar is that I was so depressed, I never studied. So 11th standard, I was doing mathematics. I got 7% in my mathematics. So I didn't know what calculus was. I knew nothing. And then I'm plunged into grad school in economics. So I had to sit and study all this stuff and come up to speed. We were sort of in the first year of differentiating, optimizing Hamiltonians, which is dynamic programming. So I had to do all this stuff. I'm still not very good at it, but I can manage, So I got to that point. And then there, I was apprenticed to Jerry Berman and Anil Deolalekar as a research assistant. And that really taught me the practice of looking at data. That's where all of that came in. And they were very encouraging, particularly Jerry, because Anil left. He said, study whatever you want, whatever. And then I studied the economics of dowries there because he had some data and all this. So, and then things proceeded. I went and got my postdoc. I became a postdoc at the University of Chicago and then at the University of Michigan, where I started expanding the interdisciplinary work. So it's always been part of me from the beginning. The PhD itself was very strictly economics. There was one chapter in Brazil that I wrote with a friend of mine that was mixing qualitative and quantitative methods, never got published. It was she had done a lot of qualitative work in Brazil, but that never got published. The work that did get published was the straightforward economics work on odd questions like dowry, I did my paper on vegetarianism, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I love the title of your, the dowry paper, The Rising Price of Husbands. And so, great title. And a couple of things to double click on. First, it's, I'm really sorry you had to go through that as a child about having your mom with schizophrenia. It's a subject that has actually come up on this podcast. Jerry Pinto and I discussed. Ram Others, a recent guest of mine, also spoke about how it really toughened her up because in a similar situation, her mom was a single mom and she had to look after her. And so she had to get a job. There is no option. It shapes you in that way. And do you feel that at some level that played a foundational role, that you can't, in a sense, be an intellectual dilettante for too long, that you can't just follow curiosities, that there is a sense that I have to start earning a living. That if I can't grok the math, I don't have a choice. I've got to stay up nights and I've got to figure it out.
Absolutely. So it disciplined me. I'm not a disciplined guy. I mean, in fact, at this stage in my life, I'm quite indisciplined. It disciplined me. I suspect, if I was, what interesting, there was a family marriage a few months ago, last May. And I was talking to all my nieces and nephews, and many of them are diagnosed with ADHD. And then I said, man, this must be a family thing. So I bet you that I'm in that. I've never been diagnosed, but I'm sure I'm there. So I find it very difficult to focus, concentrate, discipline. This disciplined me absolutely. The need to make a living. It's an anxiety. That if I don't succeed, my mother will be on the street. As to go to Bangalore on holiday and stay with her and watch this up close. I'll never forget once. She couldn't pay she belonged to some club and she couldn't pay the bill. And she goes, I must have been 16, she goes to that billing office and say, this was her little sort of enclave in the club, it was a haven for her. And she was kicked out because she couldn't pay the bill. And, watching this having a sort of basically a bankrupt parent walking out. And I remember that accountant guy then doing a rude gesture behind her back, watching that. And I was a big guy. I was 16. I was already 5'9" or something. I just socked him in the jaw. I couldn't, I couldn't take it. And they didn't do anything. Nobody, because people saw what had happened. And I said, how dare you do that? And so it did two things to me. It made me disciplined. It made me enormously conscious of gender issues. Because everything my mother went through was a gender issue other than the health. But why did she go over the top? It was because she was a divorced woman in the 1970s in the Brahmin part of Bangalore. Yeah. Which means that she was going through hell, And I don't blame my father for this at all. The divorce happened long before that. But, watching my mother go through this was wrenching, disciplining, shaping, and it also, I think, on a very personal level, made me a very awkward person, and it took a long time for me to get out of that awkwardness. But so it had a profound effect on my life as I think about it. And I've studied a lot of weird things, but I've never studied mental illness, mainly because I feel it'll be just too close and it'll be too hard for me to do it. So, yeah.
Tell me about the effect of J Krishnamurti on you, because you said you discovered him in school and it meant a big deal. Tell me about that.
So my father's family is, they are a Matunga family. So they're very disciplined, very goal-oriented, you have to succeed, success, and, so everybody's like that without exception. And I go to the school where I walk in. I went with my friend Gajendra Lal. We both joined on the same day. He came for other reasons. I came for other reasons. And just watching this gorgeous place. Firstly, beauty of the Rishi Valley. We were privileged to be there. So Rishi Valley in those days was not the Rishi Valley of today, where Rahul Gandhi was supposed to go and all. Not that place at all. It was a relatively inexpensive school, and even if you couldn't afford it, they would give you a scholarship to go. Of course, we had the money, but others didn't. And it didn't have that prestige aspect to it, right? But it was beautiful. And then for 2 months a year, J Krishnamurti would come into campus. Watching him walk in, I remember the first time I saw him, he was just walking along a path near some trees. He was a profoundly beautiful man. I mean, in the sense of there was an ethereal quality to him. And he would dress in these starched, crisp kurta pajama. He would walk past and you would watch him and say, there's something special about that. When you're a 9-year-old kid, you don't know anything, right? You just see this figure. And he would then come. And he would talk. He was talking in those days about the Vietnam War and about. I didn't understand 90% of what he said. It just went over my head. I would just sit there. There's a picture, that showed up on the internet recently of me watching it from the audience. And my eyes are wide. It's like, what? So it was just a atmosphere, a mahal in some ways. I think the one thing I took was society imposes constraints on you that sort of make no logical sense. Because at the end, the search for meaning is about breaking out of dogma and finding your own journey in ways that help you, in effect, realize the ultimate reality within yourself. And that's basically that's his basic message, at least my interpretation of his message, which means be free. be free in how you think, in what you observe, and how you experience the world. And of course, many people have interpreted Krishnamurti in many, many different ways. He's had an influence on everybody from George Lucas to all kinds of people, right? I mean, that famous young Indiana Jones, Krishnamurti is a character, who meets the young Indiana Jones. So he's had a profound effect on a lot of people. And for me, the effect was at this very young age, getting this atmosphere of freedom and of not tolerating people who impose idiotic constraints on you, And to this day, that remains with me. So that's been a huge effect. But also, it's a lifelong quest for a spiritual journey that he put me on. And then I think at the same time, I'll never forget one instance with him. So the big thing, he would come and give these talks in school, and people would raise their hands to ask questions, and if he called you to ask the question, that was a big thing. So there's a bit of it's a stupid story, but I should tell it because it's funny. I had gone to Madras. My dad was working in Madras in those years in Chennai, and he had just become a single guy. He wanted to show his son a good time. He said, "You pick your own clothes. You pick what you want." So I said, we went to the Bini shop to buy some material. I'm going to make a pair of pants, and I loved these pants. There was some material which had printed patches. In those days you wear patches, so they were printed patches. I want this brown color pants. Made a pair of jeans with bell bottoms and everything. So I'm very proud of those pants. So I was wearing those. One of the time J Krishnamurti was there, I raised my hands. I'd never raised my hand before. I raised my hand. I must have been 11 years old or something. So he looks at me. And the greatest achievement for a kid in Rishi Valley was being called to the stage, to the podium where Krishnamurti was sitting. Wow. So he said, he gestures to me to come to the stage. So I'm like, oh man, wow. So I walk slowly to the stage. He puts his hand next to him. He says, sit down. So sit next to him. And he looks at me, and he's looking at me for what seems like 20 hours, but it must have been, 30 seconds. He looks at me. And of course, Krishnamurti was a very silent man, that he would speak. And he looks at me. Young man, where on earth did you get those awful trousers? So this man was so elegant. So that was, anyway, that, I don't know if that taught me any life lesson. But it teaches me that this man was human. My wife and I recently went to Ojai in California, where he lived, and went to his house. And, he was a very human guy. And he lived for many, many years with Mary Zimbalist. People know this. And they didn't have a physical relationship, I don't think, but they were roommates in that house. Mary Zimbalist was the wife of, I think I forget his name, some Zimbalist, who was the producer of Ben-Hur. Okay? Which is a great movie. This Zimbalist made so much money from Ben-Hur, and then he dies. He died before the movie won an Oscar. In fact, his wife, Mary Zimbalist, went and picked up the Oscar for him. And she inherited all the Ben-Hur ka money. And she gave all that to J Krishnamurti.
Oh, wow.
So J Krishnamurti's life has been financed by Ben-Hur. That's something people don't quite know. Yeah, so he's had a tremendous influence on me, I think much more in hindsight than then, because as I think about how I function, it's very much in what had been unconsciously brought to me as a child. And I've read a few things by him, of course, since then, but I don't think, it's not his writings, it's his being, his personhood in some ways, and what he would say in his lectures.
I'm struck by what you said about, that awareness that you got from him, that you have to free yourself of these constraints and so on. And when I look back on sort of my growing up, I think of a whole bunch of, whether you call them constraints or circumstances, that we normalize. We take them for granted. And it is only with time that one by one we peel the layers off. And I'm curious about, what layers peeled off for you earlier than for others through the childhood. Like, I'm guessing seeing the way your mom was treated would have peeled back layers of gender, perhaps layers of caste, since you mentioned that was a Brahmin-dominated area. And so what other layers were there? Because I think what I too often find young people doing, and and it's a trap that people can get into, is that they don't question anything around them. So you just get drawn into a groove almost by default. You assume this will be my career, I will get married, I will have children. You live that groove all your life and you never kind of question it. But it seems that through circumstance, you were questioning some of that stuff. So tell me about that process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I see why you're such a good podcaster. I think the first thing is when, I had a very happy young childhood. I had two extremely loving parents. And that fell apart when I was around 7, 8. My parents used to fight like crazy. They would throw plates at each other. They would scream at each other. It happens to a lot of divorced kids. So you try to leave the house. So at 7 or 8, I would leave the house. We lived in a building in Nepean Sea Road in Bombay. And I would run down and I would then hang out with all the kids in that area. But the kids were not the building kids. They were the kids of the drivers and the cooks who lived in the servants' quarters downstairs, because they were the kids around. So I got into that gang. And they were all kinds of kids. Who knew whose religion, caste, you don't know anything about. They were just kids, right? But then they were in the habit of going to the nearby kirana shops and stealing chocolates, stealing BDs. So I started doing that with them. And then that's why I think my parents decided to send me to boarding school. So watching me go through that. But what it indicates is the end of security. You're on your own. I don't want to make a too big a deal of this, but I think it's really, really important in not having a safe place. There's nothing is safe except you. You're the only safe place, right? And then, of course, in boarding school, my safety came from Rishi Valley itself, from the school, from the nature of it. And the message there was be free, right? So I've been brought up because it's, of course, my mother's life, to sort of wonder about societal constraints and what they tell you. The things that are given to you are actually not what they seem. So why follow them? Question them. You may take a few things, but why question them? So, that's been enormously important to me. Part of that, interesting, it can go in both ways, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to go in a liberal way. That's the point I want to make. In that, later on, I'm going forward to my college days, I took a class of sociology of religion with a very wonderful sociologist called Father Masya, who was also the director of St. Xavier's College, as a Jesuit, and lovely man. And he started teaching Radha Krishnan and Hinduism and everything. And I was missing my Rishi Valley times a lot. And I started reading all these things. I started reading the Gita, I started reading Radha Krishnan, I started reading the Upanishads. And that brought me to Hinduism and has made me an extremely, I don't know what devout, but a very observant Hindu, right? So that's very much part of me, because to me, that's a freeing experience, because steeped in that, then I can expand the world. And at the end, J Krishnamurti, I'm realizing, was extremely, he never spoke about this explicitly, but he is at the end of Vedanta. That's where he's coming from at the end. It's a modernized version of that, right? So it leads you in all kinds of directions. Of course, in my work as well, that's where I'm coming from. And the practical side comes with needing to make a living. So what I think my specialty has been is trying to have all this while not going crazy, while trying to make a living and staying in a way that there is money in the bank and, I can take care of my mother and so on and so forth.
I'm very fascinated by how, people find different kind of anchors in their lives. And I'm guessing that at one level, therefore, Hinduism and getting into that was also an anchor for you. And when you call yourself someone to whom, a Hindu, someone to whom the religion means something, I'm guessing you don't mean it in the sense of a literal belief in the religion or even a belief in God. That's not necessarily, that's completely orthogonal. In fact, I would imagine it's more about the philosophy and what it means to you and the different ways in which it anchors you. So is that the case? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, I can. Obviously, the philosophy is what matters the most. I read the Gita every day. I have since I was, 18. I start my day with that. I start my day with puja to Lord Krishna. So it's part of what anchors me. I never talk about this. I don't know. You're opening me up, so I'll talk about it. In fact, when people come home and they see a puja room and a puja area in my house, they're a little bit shocked, but it's there. Recently, my wife and I went to the Udupi Krishna temple. I dragged her along. She's not like this at all. Because it meant something to me, and it anchors. I think because of whatever I went through as a child, my father he's like this, but not at all. He's not a religious guy. In fact, he's also deep. My grandmother was very religious, and I think all of this comes a little bit from that. It's a sense of security that provides. But to me, Lord Krishna is about the Krishna of the Gita, and the bhakti comes from there. And of course, music leads me to bhakti as well. All the bhakti poets of Karnataka, I strongly feel a lot of kinship with Dasar Padagolu, as you say, the songs of Dasas. And as it turns out, because of my exposure to the Mansoor family, the Lingayat tradition, and the Basvana's vachanas and all of that, Akka Mahadevi, all those vachanas also mean a lot to me. And of course, the great traditions of the Hindi traditions of Krishna poetry and Geet Govinda from Jayadeva, from Orissa, all that are very much a part of me. So all of that, I in the sense, it's anchoring the part that I refuse to tolerate that doesn't have to go with bigotry. That's the part I cannot stand. Yeah, I can be all this. But then there are great traditions from Islam, the great traditions, the idea of caste and so on. These are things that we can have this and not have to have that. So, yeah.
Do you think that just as, I wonder about the inevitability of certain movements, like earlier we were talking about about academia, and I wonder if it is inevitable given incentives and given the way we are as human beings, that splintering would happen, that each discipline would go into its silo. And in a similar sense, I wonder if it is inevitable given our tribal hardwirings and so on, that religious traditions would often sort of progress in such a way that the worst aspects of them become highlighted and pick up in popularity. Like with Hinduism, the aspects that have actually gotten amplified in recent decades are these worst aspects of bigotry and casteism and so on and so forth.
So this debate I actually have with my wife all the time, and so she is of the perspective of what you're saying. She believes that to be true. I'm a little more hopeful in the following sense. I think, I've been, like so many of us Indians, deeply influenced by Gandhiji and his approach to these things. And I think he showed us a way. And we have to modernize his message in some ways. We have to think of what the relevance of his message is for today. I mean, if you look at the research on this, two friends, Ashu Bharshane's book on sort of Hindu-Muslim relations, and his finding that when they traded, when they engaged in commerce, that resulted in greater harmony. Then a former student of mine and now a great friend, Soumitra Jha, who's at Stanford, he's built that into a whole career of empirical work, causal empirical work, showing that in the port cities of India, which had a lot of Hindu-Muslim trades, you have much less violence now. And that trade happened centuries ago. That tradition still continues. It's the interaction that makes the difference. When you're able to see people as human beings and not as the other. Yeah, but you're quite right. The tendency we have as human beings is to separate. And I think the internet's amplified that. So what I spend a lot of my time doing nowadays is to think about what institutions can we build so that we're able to listen to the other. And if you think of the rise of the MAGA movement in the United States, of even the Hindutva in India, these are people have these points of view. We cannot think that we are better than them because they have that point of view. We have to find ways of engaging that treat everybody equally. And that's, of course, Charles Taylor's politics of recognition. How do we engender that politics of recognition? I think the first thing, as many of my liberal friends have a problem seeing somebody who expresses a fondness for Hinduism as being somebody they can hang out with. Which is why I try to say I'm a Hindu, because I am. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be hanging out with me. Similarly, I'm going to hang out with my relatives and friends who are, maybe former RSS, because I'm going to find the point of commonality I have with them. How do we build institutions along those lines? Which is why I did this book with Paramita Sanyal called Oral Democracy, which was really a way of, we have this magical institution in rural India called the Gram Sabha. And you read those transcripts, you see people of all kinds coming in and engaging in equal rhetorical terms with the other, whether they're lower caste, upper caste, different religions, gender, or even. So there is some hope there, I think. So, the rest of my life, I want to find ways of researching, building, thinking about how we can do that better.
That's resonant to me because something that I've been thinking about for a long time and something that I keep talking about on the show as well. So those of my listeners for whom I'm repeating myself, please excuse me. But it's about the distinction between the abstract and the concrete. Like I did an episode with Aanchal Malhotra and she had done this book on partition and, looking at people's memories of partition. And she had gone over to, I think, Lahore or Karachi, I forget where. And she was talking to a family who had crossed over. And at one point they got carried away in the emotion and they were saying Hindus are like this, Hindus are like that. And then they noticed she's sitting there and they say, "Tum nahi beti, tum theek ho." And for me, that it's a great story that brings about that in the abstract you can hate someone, but in the concrete, when they are in front of you, it becomes practically impossible to hate them, right? And what I feel is happening in modern life is that we are retreating more and more into the abstract through our black screen, through our black mirrors, right? Where often, even if you and I are sitting together at a cafe, we may be sharing into our respective phones, and in our respective phones is not the real world, but the abstract space where we don't see the person as a person with all their multitudes and all the beauty that every human being contains. And you asked as a rhetorical question, what can we do to ameliorate this? You gave one concrete example of the Gram Sabha, but what are the other possible ways out of this is something I think about.
Right. So this is my CFAR group, which is called Boundaries, Membership and Belonging. They're all people who think about this question. So we are all writing a paper on this subject. We've not, still it's got some ways to go, so I can't really talk much about it. But I think that's the big challenge of our times. I can tell you what is not working. I think the way we currently structure democracy is not working. Yeah. Because it's become the first past the post sort of electoral democracy, and that brings out the worst in us. And of course, it's then dominated by corporations and elites, and everybody has to suck up to everybody else. And in India, there's an enormous amount of corruption because of that. There are many other bad things, but this is another thing. Yeah? Because you have to otherize and engage in clientelist politics in order to win in many, many democracies, including the United States. So I think there's something, and let me, if you don't mind, I want to
Please.
indulge me on that trajectory of thinking. What is democracy after all? I mean, fundamentally, and John Elster made this point beautifully some time ago, where he says that it is basically a version of collective action. We have a diversity of people. We have to make things happen. We have to do things, policy. So we find ways of collectivizing. Electoral democracy is one route towards that, which is you elect a representative who then represents your interests. So Elster calls it aggregative democracy, where you're adding up votes. And of course, first past the post is the way we normally do it, which is the simple way of simple majority, which then has all these perverse consequences. It's what I've been calling the 3 C's: capture, clientelism, corruption. They're all consequences of it. Now, why I'm fonder of deliberative democracy is because I feel that face-to-face interaction humanizes people. It's exactly what you're saying. And by encountering the other in a way that is materially important, which means that you make a decision that's going to affect your lives, you have to get along at least in one. There's one point of intersection. There may be many points of non-intersection. There's one point of intersection. And that point of intersection means that you see them as human beings. Yeah. People have criticized that by saying, they may be subject to elite capture and so on. We don't see much of that going on in Gram Sabhas in India. Maybe because they're non-consequential, I don't know. But that we don't see evidence of that. What I think we have to find ways of doing is bringing the electoral and the deliberative forms of democracy together. That's what is the answer. How we do it, where we do it, there's an enormous amount of thinking that needs to be done there. There are some countries, and one country I do want to visit is Estonia, which apparently is learning how to do this in the digital sort of virtual environment. I was just in Switzerland, which has been doing this for a long time. But the Swiss evolved it over many centuries of various things that they went through. I think there's a lot to be done and a lot to think about in this direction, about how do we make collective decisions? How do we govern ourselves in ways that don't result in this separation? I think that's the big challenge that we all have to worry about, along with climate change. Ironically, I think if we figure this one out, we'll also be able to cope with climate change a little bit better, because at least at the local level, we'll know how to collectivize. So I think climate change will actually help that process because we're all suffering the same problem. That will bring us together in some ways, I hope.
One of the sort of important insights in your work for me when I was going through it was this distinction between electoral democracy and deliberative democracy and how we don't pay enough attention to the second. But just to think about the first for a moment, electoral democracy, it often strikes me that in practically every area of the world, we are left with forms or system designs that are an artifact that came about because of an earlier time and an earlier need and no longer apply. For example, the first past the post system is an artifact of a completely different time, and there are many different kinds of proportional representation which can help. You can design different kinds of incentive systems in them, so you can actually incentivize moderation and dialogue and away from extremism and so on. I think one system that's been proposed is that people rank 1, 2, 3, and then you look at the weightages. So the polarizing guys who are like number 1 and number 5 won't win so often as the guys who are 2 and 3 more often. So that's like one example of incentivizing moderation and appealing to whatever. But what's happening is that the world is changing incredibly rapidly. Technology is empowering individuals and globalizing them, even if nation states become more and more insular in their politics. And by the time a new design comes up, the world will have changed again. And a new design is extremely unlikely to come up because no one who is benefiting from the current system is ever going to give away any of the power they have. Like I did an episode with JP Narayan where he said that he circa 2004-5 actually got all the parties to agree to proportional representation, and only Sonia Gandhi stood against it, and her logic must have been that, hey, we are in power, why should I give away some of it? And which is ironic, given the current situation. So what is your sense of that? Because it's not just politics, it's not just electoral systems. Across everything I see the mainstream is broken down. All existing forms are an artifact, but nothing has taken its place. Yeah. But, in the context of democracy, what do you feel?
There is an ideal world and the practical world, right? And I want to stay with the practical world. And the practical world, at least as a human being, there's nothing that I personally can do about fixing national electoral systems. I don't know how to do that. And I don't know if anybody's going to listen to me anyway. I'll give you a small example on proportional representation. I was in an Uber yesterday, actually. And the Uber driver was a woman who lived in Anacostia in DC. And she was complaining about Biden and all this. She was a delegate, last Democratic delegate. I don't know why she's driving an Uber, but I didn't get into that story. We had a short ride. But she was complaining because DC is going to introduce proportional representation. And she was saying, my people. So the way DC structures Ward 7 and 8, we call them Ward 15, when you add them together, are the poorest wards of the city, and they're largely African American. And she was saying, my people will not just are confused by this. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to work with it. So there's another problem with all of this, that it's complicated. Simple majority is easy. Proportional is very hard to get. How do I vote? What do I do? How do I game the system? How do I represent my interests? Even though it shouldn't be, but it is. I said, what about, can't we have information sessions and so on? She said, no, that's not going to work with my people. I'm quoting her. But DC again. There was a mayor called Anthony Williams 20 years ago. That was when DC, for DC for a long time was under receivership. Congress would run DC. There was no democratic election. And Anthony Williams was the guy who was appointed by Congress to run the city. And then when elections came, he did a great job. Then he sort of persuaded them to bring elections back, and he ran for mayor and he won the first time. He was actually a mixed race guy, but he won with the white vote. I think he was adopted by a white family or something. I forget his personal history. But anyway, he won with the white vote, and Ward 7 and 8 did not touch this man. What does he do? He starts introducing what he calls town halls in Ward 7 and 8. And I was sent by the bank to help with this at some point. So I sat with them. Where in these wards, you would have these Gram Sabhas. And people would come. They would discuss their priorities. Mayor would be there sometimes. Sometimes you would. I remember sitting, in one of those town halls, and at a table, I was the only Indian guy there, and the only person who recognized me as an Indian came and sat next to me was the great Marion Barry. Marion Barry was the great man of DC, right? And he had a very, very interesting up and down life. He sits next to me. You're from India? I said yes. Dr. King really was very fond of India. I said, yes. So we had that conversation. We went there, we went to Gandhi and all that. But what was very interesting to me was how that ability of Mayor Williams to go and talk to these people and learn the needs of the ward and then change his policies along the line helped him in his next election. He ran for re-election. He won an overwhelming majority, even from Ward 7 and 8. Yeah, so there are electoral gains to doing deliberation. That's the lesson I took from that. Since then, it has stopped. They don't do that anymore. That's gone away. So I feel that connection, going from the bottom up, being reflexive in policy making, bringing that bottom up perspective into how you make decisions really makes a huge difference. There are practical advantages to that. Yeah. So that then leads me to the second point. And of course, I've done a lot of work on the panchayat system in India because I think it's an example of that. I think at the local level, we can make it happen. I think that's where I'm coming to. I don't know what to do at the national level, but I think at the local level, we can happen. And the local level, I'm doing some work in Nepal along those lines. There's a lot of need. Because in Nepal, for instance, what we're finding is the effects of climate change on people's lives. Whether you go to the high mountains, you go to the hills, or you go to the terai, the valley side, the effects of climate change have been devastating on all three levels. And from floods, landslides, hugely confusing weather patterns, so people don't know how to farm. But that strengthening the ability of local people to deal with it by collectivizing themselves. As we walked down to the studio, we saw a picture of Eleanor Ostrom, bringing her perspectives in. But Ostrom, of course, she was talking about not democracy, but of collective action largely. But I think we can, if we institutionalize it, we get a form, a constitutionalized form of democracy. Now, the constitutionalization is important. We have it in India in the 73rd Amendment. You have it in Nepal with the 2015 Constitution. Other countries, Switzerland, of course, has it. Many countries don't have it. That's something we can fight for. Yeah. If you constitutionalize it, then it's there. And at least that's I think, the answer to your very important question. That's one answer that I can give. Others may have other answers. That's one answer I can give.
To what extent does a part dependence of the early design of the system, a lot of which happens through happenstance, shape it? Like in the sense, I had an episode with Subhashish Bhadra where he made the interesting point that if you look at our different constitutions, the American Constitution is the way it is because of the circumstances of its founding. So there's a emphasis on individual liberty. Federalism is a big deal. Whereas when the Indian Constitution happened, the nation hadn't come together yet. The sort of the fast-track colonization of hundreds of princely states that Sardar Patel and VP Menon carried out was just underway. There were riots all over. The Constituent Assembly sits in Delhi. You don't know if the center will hold. So there is that centralizing impulse, and as a result, power is centralized too much. And as a result, the federalism is really a federalism only in name. It's not decentered enough. Plus, there is a simultaneous sort of debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar on the role of villages, where Ambedkar quite correctly points out that, hey, villages are a sink of localism and ignorance and blah, 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 and therefore local self-government is too dangerous. There'll be elite capture. The upper caste will just, continue apace, and we can't have that. And that, that logic is completely sound. And therefore we centralize. And now it's like, and there's a part dependence to that, to the nature of the state. And that breeds all the vices that are currently sort of wrong with our system. So how do we think about this? Like, far as the 73rd Amendment went, Shruti Rajgopalan, our friend, had an episode with me where she spoke about that even within a city, the people I vote for don't have the power to help me. And the people who have the power to help me, they don't need my vote, just because of the way state politics is structured. It's a great episode on urban governance. I'll link from the show notes. So what is your sense of that? That is this inherently a more frustrating and difficult exercise in India than in the USA?
And there are many questions in that one. Let me start with one, and we can expand on that if you're interested. And let me focus on the India case. I mean, the US is another story. The magic of the 73rd Amendment is that it brings to... I just finished a paper on this called 250,000 Democracies with M.R. Sharan and Siddharth George. So if people want to read that they may find that interesting. The magic of the 73rd Amendment was that it brings in both Ambedkar and Gandhiji. Because it has within rural India reservations for women, reservations for Dalits, reservations in many states for other backward castes, and of course reservations for scheduled tribes. And now that we've had more than 30 years experience on this, we can see the results of that effect. And the basic story with reservations is as follows. And I'm not talking about reservations for jobs, just for this political reservations. Initially, it results in a lot of tokenism. Over time, people take power. Yeah, and it sort of starts really showing a more equal politics. Now, different states are on different trajectories on this. But I think that's where it's going to evolve. That's the broad thing. Also because I think it has in the constitution the idea of the Gram Sabha. So they will elect their local representative who they know personally because it's a small space, and they have to meet in meetings where the fellow has to encounter them and have a discussion with them. There are other problems with it which people can read that paper for. So yes, Ambedkar was right, but I think the 73rd Amendment addresses Ambedkar's concerns while bringing in Gandhiji's ideas. And remember, it's not just Ambedkar who was against villages. Nehru was also against it because he wanted a more he was interested in socialism and this macroeconomy and socialist growth, in effect, was his idea, and he wanted big industries and all that. So he wasn't terribly interested in this. He was not a village guy. He was a city guy. He was an upper caste city guy. Gandhiji was not, at least he evolved in a different direction. I remember your wonderful episode with Ramchandra Goa. He talks about this, about his evolution. But I mean, the way I see Gandhiji is sort of like this NRI who comes back and then, of course, discovers India, right? And he discovers India through a chap called Henry Maine. Karuna Mantena, who you might want to have on as somebody you talk to, has written beautifully on this. And Henry Maine, I mean, I'm digressing, but the thing with the East India Company.
But please digress. I'm encouraged. Yeah.
The East India Company, the closest analog to the East India Company, other people have made this argument today, is the World Bank, okay, which is largely a institution still steeped. I mean, the East India Company was explicitly colonial. The World Bank is still steeped in the memory of colonialism. We can talk about that if you're interested. But John Stuart Mill was the chief economist of the East India Company. That was his job, it was his father's job, James Mill's job. And he's a genius, so he spent 2 hours doing his job. Rest of the time, he wrote all his books. Henry Maine was in the research department of the East India Company. So he sort of had my job. And in particular, he was the guy who was tasked with looking at rules around land and property rights in India. In the process, he did an enormous amount of field work. This is also the time of Charles Booth and Charles Dickens. So there was a lot of this business. So you need to go to the ground to understand what's going on. He was one of those guys. He goes and discovers all these village democracies in India. And he says, what the heck is going on here? I'm walking everywhere. And Mill talks about, village democracy. He sees that Mill gets influenced by them and goes and says, hey, we need to start thinking about democracy's grassroots. And Mill actually writes about this. And I don't know if this is explicitly true. I think reading Maine discovers these village democracies, and what we found in our paper, and there's a lot more work to be done on this, I don't know if I'll do it or somebody else will, about the history of local democracy in India. It's a long history, and it goes back to the Rig Veda. I mean, you see hints of it right back from there, of this idea of collective action coming by a deliberation. It's an old idea in India, predates the Greeks. In fact, Thomas Troutman has an article in India Forum about this. So I think we need to take that very, very seriously, right? Democracy is as much of the subcontinent as it is of the Greek islands. It starts. Who knows who got it first? I'm not going to make any claim on that, but it certainly happened at the same time. Yeah. So I forgot my train of thought, but I think where we need to take that seriously is how do we turn that into something that doesn't fall into the Ambedkar trap, if you wish. Yeah. And I think that's what the 70th Amendment has done effectively, because there is no question, whatever divisions we have a democracy in India, old democracy, whether electoral or deliberative, goes back, we have from the Cholas, from the Vijayanagar period, there are lots of things. It was dominated by elites, dominated by upper castes. I mean, you don't even hear of Dalit in that process. So that was the mistake, and Ambedkar was right about that.
So, just thinking aloud, it strikes me that when we speak of democracy, actually it's two separate things. There's a democracy of a nation state which is sort of imposed from the top down, and a bunch of constitution makers will sit down and make a constitution and design a system and etc. etc. And its origins very much lie in the origins of the nation state itself, which is a violent origin, that you're collecting taxes and you're sending people to war and etc. etc. And the second vision of democracy is that it emerges from the bottom up as something that is necessary. That you're no longer a tribe, you're gathering in, whether it's with agriculture or whatever, you're gathering in larger groups. How do we manage our affairs? The old ways don't work, and therefore you have your Gram Sabhas, as it were, and you have deliberate democracy, and it is rooted in the people, and therefore it is rooted in the culture. It is a natural way of solving problems. And I think, again, I'm just thinking aloud, that one of the tragedies, perhaps, of our nation is that top-down version of democracy imposed a design on a system that, subdued that second bottom-up vision. But if I understand you correctly, what you're sort of saying is that, the bottom-up vision is just natural. It is already, its DNA is in the DNA of our culture, that it can emerge, that it will work if it's just enabled and given a chance.
Yeah, I'm going to go even further than that. I want to make sure I keep my train of thought here.
Take your time. We'll cut this out. No problem.
It's the nature of people who think they're very smart to think they can fix everything, which is what results in top-downism. And that top-downism goes back to the post-Marxian thinking. It goes back to, Keynesian thinking. It goes back to many, many forms of thinking. I mean, we are again sitting in the Mercator Center, Hayek versus Keynes. It's exactly that debate, right? Nehru was a socialist, which means he was a top-down thinker. Gandhiji was not. He was a bottom-up guy. Yeah. What does top-down mean for a socialist? It is that I am so smart that I can fiddle with the systems to make people better off. I don't care what people think. I know better than them. That train of thinking continues to post. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying it's bad or good. I'm not going to make a value. I will make a value judgment at the end. Right now, I don't want to. If you think about how policy is done, let's say tax policy or monetary policy, it's all about fiscal policy. Any programs, and we throw in whatever programs we throw in, whether it's on health and education. It's all about the top working through the bureaucratic system to fix things. This is certainly true of India. Karthik's book, of course, talks all about that. Implementation becomes central, because implementation is all about the top flowing down to the bottom. And of course, there have been great gains from this. I don't want to deny any of that. There's an even worse version of this, which is what Land goes on about, which is that basically when we are so smart that as social scientists, we think we can do RCTify everything or nudge everything. And by using nudges, what is a nudge? At the end, and this is my problem with behavior, what is a nudge at the end? The nudge is I'm so smart that I know better than you what is good for you. You read Cass Sunstein on this. He may be a liberal philosopher, but he's a nudger. He will tell you explicitly. There's no such thing as he writes about liberal nudges. I don't think there's any such thing, because so long as I think I'm better than you or smarter than you, then I know what's good for you. Yeah. Now it's another story if I say I need to lose some weight, as I do, and I'm going to subscribe to an app or something that's going to help me lose weight because it's going to incentivize my losing. I am choosing the nudge. Nobody's telling me to choose the nudge, right? But when there is a world that says you are poor because you don't sleep enough, that's what my research has found, brilliant research. So I'm going to disperse blankets to all of you and make you sleep better rather than give you some cash. Okay? That's a nudge, right? That's telling me my research has shown you what's good for you. So this is very paternalistic. I mean, so post-Keynesian thinking is not paternalistic in the sense that it is always rooted in democratic logic. So, and there you can sort of go into, say, look at the Tory sort of Labour debate in the UK. But paternalism, or what I call neo-paternalism, is very much driven by universities at MIT and Harvard and places like that have turned into this the nature of causality. Why are you so obsessed with causality? Because you want to fix things. Why are you doing an RCT? Because you want to fix things. And maybe there's a lot of good in that. But it denies the primacy of the people you're trying to fix, whose lives you're trying to make better. What about them? Don't they know certain things better than you do? Yeah? That's where the bottom-up comes in. And I think it's been extraordinarily neglected. And it's consistent. I mean, we talked about the paper on reflexive economics. This is the policy analog of that. Yeah. How do we reduce the distance between people and what is done to people? How do we reduce that? I don't think we can make it zero. In most things, we can't make it zero. We can reduce that distance. How do we do it? And that's the basic challenge. And I think, as I said, that's what I want to think about for whatever time I have left as a scholar, is how do we make that better? Yeah. The Gram Sabhas are one example. You come to what Nepal has tried, and I think this is it should be sort of studied a lot more, what's happening in Nepal. Nepal, as you know, had a civil war. And the civil war, there's a lot of debates about why that civil war happened. But one clear thing is it's a war of ethnicity, because Nepal is 300 types of people there. And they were all very sort of geographically located. So at the end, a lot of that war was about the dominance of the Newars and others and the Ranas and, people saying, hey, listen to me, you're neglecting me. How did they resolve that at the end of the war? They come up with the Nepali constitution that divides up Nepal into 750-something local governments and the central government, and minimizes the role of the state government, what they call the provincial government, and the districts. They were very important earlier. They were minimized. So most of the power is now divided between the center and the local. Okay? Amazing. 50% of power, you read the constitution, look at the jurisdictions, 50% goes to the center, 50% to the local. Even tax authority. So it's much better than the Indian system in that way. And the Nepali tradition on participatory democracy goes back a long way. Elite dominated. In fact, they used to call their democracy the panchayat system. I mean, that was when they still had royalty. They always had a system where within the ward, within the village, people would have collective decisions, and it goes back to the 40s and 30s. I'm actually writing a paper. There's a couple of Nepali scholars. What the constitution does is to at least have on paper all those institutions. In practice, it is not working. Practice is not working because at the end, the nature of Nepali politics, which is coalition politics at the center, is what is dominating everything. And local governments are free for all. It's laissez-faire. And some places are great, some places are terrible. We actually don't know which is good and which is bad because we have no data. So I think in Nepal, what needs to be done is better data, better understanding, incentivizing, figuring out what to do better. I gave a talk just last month in Kathmandu on this. And trying to strengthen the constitutional processes that are already there, because their constitution is amazing in that sense. The potential of that constitution is amazing. India, the problem is slightly different, which is we have this wonderful 73rd Amendment, which has been around for 32 years. We completely underfund village governments. So there's a lot of democracy with no money. Yeah. Mostly what they do is implement NREG and other things, which is important, but they're implementing shops. Even in that space, they're doing wonderful things, better things than, we've just finished a paper in Karnataka showing, Karnataka had this very interesting thing happen during COVID, which is their panchayat elections were supposed to be held at the COVID period, 2000. COVID hit, lockdown happens, they postpone the election by 2 years. According to Karnataka law, when you postpone election, a bureaucrat takes over the governance of the village. So as it turned out, there were about 300 villages, panchayats, one panchayat of 3 to 4 villages, were on a different election cycle for pretty arbitrary reasons. So we're able to compare those 300 panchayats to the others that were bureaucratically run. So we can compare the bureaucratically run places, top-down places, with the bottom-up places, that democratically run. And we find on a variety of indicators, the bottom-up is doing better. Yeah, except in the top-down is doing badly on most things, but they're also not discriminating. The bottom-up is discriminating. Yeah, so you find that difference, which I think that discrimination part is fixable, because we can have incentives, we can have rules, we can have methods to fix it. So I think if you take a practical approach to this very profound problem, we may not be able to solve all of it, but we can make some headway in a new form of democracy that combines electoral with deliberative, understands the Ambedkarian concerns, and those apply all over the world, tries to fix them, and tries to figure out how to make it better. So I think that's, yeah.
In fact, I was, you wrote a paper called The Added Value of Local Democracy on exactly what you're describing. And I was struck by this line from that quote: the findings showed that local democracy aligns spending more closely with citizen preferences, but those gains accrue more to men, upper castes, and other advantaged social groups. Stop quote. And it seems that, both Gandhi and Ambedkar could cherry pick part of the sentence and say, see, I was right.
Correct. And that's exactly right. And I think the big difference between the Gandhian and the Ambedkarian perspective is bringing them together. Ambedkar's concerns can be fixed with policy.
Yeah.
Gandhi's concerns require a social movement, require a different way of thinking. So and that's the challenge. I think partly we're at a very early stage. 200 years from now, we will have different forms of, if we survive as a species, we'll have different ways of governing ourselves. And I'm not even sure, actually, I worry sometimes, as do so many people, that electoral democracy at the highest level will even survive. I think we may well move towards a more autocratic form of government in many parts of the world, because people are not finding themselves listened to in the electoral process. Many people around the world. Yeah? And there are many reasons for that. If we're going to preserve some form of citizen participation, we really have to both think and experiment and mobilize towards that, because otherwise we're likely to lose it.
On that somber note, let's take a quick commercial break and come back more cheerful and well-fed. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still with Biju Rao. And let's go back to your life now. And I go into these digressions myself because as themes occur to me, I just can't help but ask all these questions. Okay. But I also want to know about your life. You've taken us to the point where you've kind of, grown up where you are, gone to college, gone to Xavier's, etc., etc. I'm interested in a couple of simultaneous processes that happen to us when we are around that age. And one process is that we feel that anxiety of fitting in with the world and fitting in with the people around us, getting their validation. And that is an interesting process, and that can play out in different ways. And simultaneously, there is the quest, perhaps unexpressed or unbeknownst to one, the quest of finding oneself. Like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, what am I good at? Like, sometimes you go into a particular stream because that's expected, that's respectable. In our times, if you were in India, engineering, medical was like the rigor if you're not studying for civil services. And, you can get into a groove, or you can choose what you do depending on what you're good at rather than what you're necessarily interested in without putting too much deep thought. So I'm interested in that shaping of yourself in your teen years perhaps and through college along these 2 dimensions.
Yeah, so I think, the 2 directions in which I wanted to go, which was in college, was either films or some sort of interdisciplinary social science centered in economics. Have been there since I was 17. And the reason is that they were both shaped by very early on. Films, as I said, because of my aunt who was an actress and my exposure to all of that and to movies, therefore. And social sciences because of my granduncle and my father, So my granduncle, J Rao, was one of India's great economists, and he founded the Delhi School of Economics, and he was Nehru's chief economic advisor, all that sort of stuff. And by the time I got to know him well, I first met him as a child. I used to be very scared of him. He would come in his forbidding presence, and he was not very good with children. He had a lovely wife, Kamlanti, who was much more gentle, and she was, just wonderful. Anyway, but he was a forbidding presence. But as he got older and became lonelier, and I was then in 10th standard studying economics, and his name would appear in the textbook. And he and I have the same name. His name is also Vijendra Rao. I'm also Vijendra. He's J Rao. First V is Vijendra. And that's not a coincidence. I was named after him. So I would see his name and it would say, this planning commission or that thing or this thing. And I would say, I better get to know this guy. Let me go talk to him. So I would start talking to him. And I think he found it very nice that some young person would want to talk to him about his life and about these things. So that was enormously influential. And he was a strong believer that whether the Delhi School of Economics or the Institute of Economic Growth or whether the Institute for Social Economic Change in Bangalore, all the institutions he founded, which exist and thrive to this day, he insisted that they be interdisciplinary. Economics should be very good, but they should be sociologists, political scientists. So he's the one who brought M.N. Srinivas to Bangalore, for instance, from Delhi. And he is the one who hired M.N. Srinivas into the Delhi school, right? He effectively started the Delhi sociology department. And to some extent, I should give my dad credit for this as well. My dad was a huge reader. And one of the best things we did with each other was to go to bookshops, whether it's Strand in Bombay or secondhand bookshops all over Bombay. And basically, I started by following his interests, which were in science fiction and non-fiction. And science fiction I never took to, but non-fiction I did. So that shaped my understanding of how to understand human beings. I could have, for instance, gone in the history direction and stuff like that. But economics, I think moving in that direction was largely my granduncle. Even though my father's an economist, it was really my granduncle talking to him and realizing that I am somehow lucky to have this man in my life with whom I'd had many, many hours of conversations. I mean, I wrote a piece in tribute to him on his centenary. They had a book that came out, where I sort of realized as I was writing the piece, he's one of my gurus. I mean, there's no way out of that. And that was the age of, between the ages of 15 to, he died 92. So I guess I was 28, 29 years old. So that, I think, and then when I went to college, I was fooled into what economics was, because Bombay University in those days, to some extent it's still true, had a very old-fashioned approach to economics. It wasn't so mathematical. There was some of that. But mainly it was reading Marx and Ricardo and Keynes and Smith and, learning about the old models that Bombay University used to produce, Pyar Brahmananda's work, Vakil, all these great Indian economists, Lakdawala. And, of course, learning about Indian planning systems, V.K.R.V. Rao. These were the people we read. We didn't read so much about Pal Samuelson's work. This came much later to me. I didn't even know. And my father, to his credit, once presented me and he said, read this, which was Paul Samuelson's Introduction to Economics. So that brought me into that world a bit, which I didn't like as much. But I felt, hey, this is fun. I can read all this stuff. I can bring everything together. I can do so many things with this. So that the issue of making it and so on, being shoved into a certain stream never came up. That I give full credit to my parents. I think my mother, if she had her way, would have wanted me to be an artist or a musician. And maybe if I'd gone to FTII, she would have been happy. But that didn't happen for the reasons I explained. So I never had any doubt that this is where I was going to go. The challenge was in making it happen. That was the journey. But there was no pressure to go into engineering. My father just absolutely didn't believe in that, which to his credit was hugely beneficial to me.
How did you evolve sort of your frames of looking at the world? Like when we are young, we tend to kind of grab the first frame that seems to explain everything. And then there is a danger that can become our one hammer for every nail for the rest of our lives. But, when I was in college, I was also reading Marx, as were you. But, you move on from there and you look at the world and, realize the complexity of the world and grow. So what were your frames and how did those frames come about? Like part of it would be personal experience, but like who are the influences? What are the books? Were there any, light bulb moments where you learned something about the world which you still remember?
It goes back to J Krishnamurti. It's experiential and it is not conditioned by what somebody else gives you. So that, I think, came to me unconsciously in Rishi Valley. What I was reading, I was reading everything. Whatever, as a lonely child, that was my refuge. It was reading, right? And so I would read, oh my God, I'd read, I don't know where to begin, right? Enormous amounts of fiction, enormous amounts of non-fiction, and not much philosophy and so on until I went to college. And then I got a little bit more social science when I went to college. Because of my father, I started reading the Foundation series of Asimov that I got hooked onto. And there's a funny story about that I'll tell you. Anyway, so And I think what I got very early on because of Krishnamurti is that as human beings, and also I think, so my father was one of the early proponents of liberalization in India. He ran something called NCER at the same time as Narasimha Rao was prime minister. So he did a lot of the economic analysis for liberalization. So I grew up in that world, in where we didn't like the idea of the license permit Raj. And I was drawn to people like Smith as well. And, that seemed to gel well with Krishnamurti in the sense that it is saying leave people alone and have them experience and discover the world. And I'm actually have not thought about this. Yeah, I'm thinking about it now. And so let me, maybe I'm wrong.
Sure.
So I'm thinking about it as I tell you these things. I think, it was not just books, it was also movies. I mean, I watched so much, I still do. And one of the lucky things I have in DC is the American Film Institute, which is up the road from where I live. I hop into a bus, I'm there in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And you get 70mm, 35mm screenings of all the classics. I mean, they showed Northern Safari every year, right? And in those days, whatever I could watch, I could watch. I remember the USIS in those days had a retrospective on Frank Capra. So I saw all of Capra's movies as a teenager, and these really, the idea of that American idea of freedom really steeped into me as I think about it. But the notion of being in the field and going directly to the field comes from Krishnamurti, came from reading Gandhiji, who I read from the beginning. I think actually not from the beginning. It was the Gandhi movie, to be honest. I mean, just watching that Gandhi movie got me into Gandhiji. So I read the story about my experiments with truth, absorbed it, and got me reading the Gita at the age of 17, 18. Gandhiji did, as well as Father Masya. So all of that, again, to me, the Gita is about understanding the limitations of the senses and trying to figure out the meaning of life by understanding those limitations and about what is self-regulation and all of that. People take different things, is what I take. And of course, the notion of action that comes from that. So all of that, I think, shaped how I saw the world. And it wasn't a particular stream. To the extent that I was surrounded by people like my father and my granduncle, my version of engineering was perhaps economics.
Wow.
That it was a natural thing to do because everybody around me was doing that. And my father, I remember, made me meet all these economists, that he knew, and they influenced me. The other, thinking, I'll say, going back, my father had 3 friends who had a great influence on me as a child, not because I talked to them at great length, I did to some extent, but because they were around and led lives very different from my father. My father was a corporate executive. He lived very well. He made a lot of money. Not many assets, but he made a good income. These guys didn't. One of them was Krishna Raj, the editor of the EPW, who was my father's classmate in Delhi school. And he would come home. And I would see him struggling, and him and his wife, Maitri Krishna Raj, both, she's one of the great feminist scholars. He is, of course, the editor of the EPW. And just watching his life, he would come with these Bata sandals. And that's why I wear sandals to this day.
Oh, wow.
It's because of him. So that learning about how the kind of dedication he had to his craft and the lack of ego with which my dad approached things with a great deal of ego. Not Krishnaraj uncle. He did it completely. It was an act of service. And that really taught me a lot. K.T. Achaya, Tammu Achaya, who was one of my father's closest friends, who was a nutritionist in the days that I knew him, and then became the father of food history, one of India's fathers of food history. He was another childhood friend. He was actually the brother of my granduncle Vikar Rao's wife. Kamla Auntie's brother was K.T. Achaya. So he was another great thing. And the third one was Rajmohan Gandhi, and it was simply another friend of my father's from Delhi University. And the emergency and what Rajmohan Gandhi had to go through because he edited Himmat in those days. My father, in the time of the emergency, lived in Madras. He co-founded the PUCL in Madras in Tamil Nadu with Cho Ramaswamy. So Cho was the chair, my father was the deputy chair. They ran the PUCL and they were doing a lot of stuff during the emergency. And we would get these things shoved under the door. And I was just, I don't know if this was perception or reality. I was always scared my father would be thrown in jail. Yeah. And then from the film side, my aunt's friend Snehalata Reddy was in fact thrown to jail. Patabi Rama Reddy, her husband, was thrown to jail. Snehalata Reddy dies in jail.
She died shortly after that, yeah.
All of that as a child had a great resonant impact on me. So I really, really strongly, as you're telling me, it really made me despise authoritarianism. Really made me despise it. And I think my inclination towards this democracy life that I lead comes from there. Yeah. So the only thing that I think I was perhaps nudged into very strongly was getting a PhD in economics.
Yeah, no, I first read about Snehalata Reddy and a tragic story in Kumi Kapoor's book about the emergency, and pretty heartbreaking and makes the blood boil. From all these people who were sort of, your heroes in different ways, were you also picking up an ethic for living, like a way of living, a value system? Like by osmosis, I think one often takes from the people who are around one, an approach towards life. And there's a lot of luck involved there who you happen to be surrounded by. And in this case, it seems that you were surrounded by people who had a love of knowledge, and B, not a desire necessarily to, indulge in the material life, even though your dad was doing well as a manager, as you've pointed out. And I'll link his great memoir from the show notes. So when you look back today in hindsight, does it feel like that a certain way of living was kind of ingrained in you just?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. Along with my grandparents, my father's father and mother, who my father's father not ran away. He had to leave home very early on. He was in Srirangam in Tamil Nadu, because his father died and he had to just survive. So, and then he married my grandmother, and my grandmother's father, who's also Biju Raos' father, was an astrologer, also a gambler. So whatever money he made, he lost. Yeah. So they both grew up in poverty, one way or the other. So that then made them extremely concerned with needing to work hard to succeed. That was their focus. And that's the Matunga culture. Anybody from Matunga will tell you the same thing, right? That was very much part of my father's family. Mother's family, was my grandfather, who I barely knew because he died when I was 12. But the little bit I knew of him, I saw the idea of trusteeship was so deeply ingrained in him, trusteeship in the Gandhian sense, that whatever money he made, he was holding in trust. And the fact, and I knew this very well, he died a broken man because he joined the freedom movement, gave all his money to the freedom movement, and then joined politics. And ironically, in those days, when you joined politics, you lost money because he neglected his business. And he handed the business that was put in charge of one of his nephews, who was a thief. Basically robbed from under his nose. So he died in debt. He was, in 1974, I understand he was 2 crores in debt, which in those days was a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
My uncle, his son, to his credit, paid it all off and revived the business. But in any case, that resonated with me a great deal, my grandfather's example. So the notion that life is not about yourself, life is about trying to do some good, all of that was very obviously there, And the life of the mind, which was all around me. I had, no inclination to do anything else but lead a life of the mind. And even if I became a filmmaker, it would have been life of the mind, probably have made no money. I would have probably died bankrupt myself. So it would have been, then I think, as I've explained, the need to take care of my mother, feeling that responsibility, disciplined me to make sure that I was able to earn a little bit. So that was the counterpoint to all of this. So it wasn't all dispersed. I would have not been a disciplined anything if it wasn't for that.
How did going abroad to study change you? Like, was it, did it come together with the anxiety that, oh my God, I have to make a living. I could have already had a job in India, etc., etc.
So, every Indian economist you'll talk to has a master's from the Delhi School of Economics. At least economists of my generation. I do not. Many of them also Bengali, but that's another story. I did not go to the Delhi School of Economics. Why? Because my father went there and my granduncle founded it. And I have my granduncle's name. So I knew I'd go there. I would be expected to perform a certain way. I didn't want any part of that. So when I was an undergrad, I finished my Xavier's bachelor's, and then, I decided to apply to US universities, not knowing anything about US universities. So I did my GRE and I sent it to 3 different places, I think, maybe 2. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, because I had some family friends who were living in Washington, and the University of Houston, because I had an uncle in Houston. Both wrote to me after that, and Houston wrote to me with a $700 a month stipend.
Wow.
1984.
Wow.
Said, come to us, we'll give $700 a month. I mean, like 20 years old. I'll make more money than my father did. He may have been a corporate guy, but $700 in those days was more than my father made. And I'm going. So that's how I ended up. And I wanted to avoid Delhi school. I just didn't want to even deal with it, even do the exam. If I flunked the exam, God knows what would happen to me. So I went to Houston. I was very lucky there in that it was actually full of young, good economists. Badi Baltaji, I mean, there are many others, all of whom had got their PhDs at the University of Pennsylvania, but for some reason. Mm-hmm. So somehow they liked me and they said, hey, you need to get out of here, you need to go to Penn, and we will write you nice letters so you get in. So they wrote me nice letters and I got in. And I got in with a tuition waiver. I didn't get a stipend. So I went to Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, as I was knocking on people's doors. And I remember seeing a door with the name Anil Dulalekar on it. It was an Indian guy. I mean, I didn't know who Anil was. Knocked on his door. And Anil said, do you know SAS? Those days SAS was the program. I said, I know. I was a research assistant in Houston. I knew SAS. Chalo, you're hired.
Wow.
So they gave me a stipend stipend was lower, $550 a month. Tuition was paid for. So I went there. And that's how I ended up. So it wasn't about escaping from anything. It was trying to, other than the Delhi School of Economics, I always thought I'd come back. I knew I wanted to do my PhD in India, on Indian issues. And I wanted to come back. So when I finished my PhD, I came, I talked to people at the Delhi School, I talked to people at then the Indira Gandhi Institute was just being set up in Bombay. And I remember going and talking to Kirit Parekh. But then the reality hit of the salary difference, And I said, hey, I can't afford this. So I can make a little bit of money in the US. I send $100. That will take care of my mother. So that was where the reality hit. And I said, I have to stay in the US. So that, and then of course, partly joining the World Bank was also because of that, because the expenses built up. Yeah. So that is that story. Yes.
And what was your sort of intellectual development like when you actually went abroad and started studying? Like what happens often in India is that we normalize the way everything is around us and we normalize a lot of received wisdom that we get. Did that distance help? Did you look at it differently? Like this is, again, the 80s, well before liberalization. We are still in that hellhole.
So yes, it did. And let me explain how in 2 or 3 different ways. One is my first day at Penn, I remember, Lawrence Klein was the big name at Penn in those days, and he had just won the Nobel Prize in economics. Very distinguished looking man. He always wore a bow tie, handsome guy. I took his class, first year, and he comes and sits in the class, and he says, hello, I'm Laurie Klein. What is your name? I said, this is the great Lawrence Klein telling me who he is. Will it ever happen in India? My granduncle was not like this. He was an enormously huge ego, right? So I said, wow, man. So it reminded me of Krishnaraj and Tamu Achaya, these people who I knew were enormously brilliant people, but very simple in how they approached the world. That really had a huge impact on me, that arrogance has no place in research. That's what that taught me. And my advisor, Jerry Berman, was exactly like that. He's still with us, very much like that. They just do their research because they love it. So that was a huge influence. That approach, you can wish an American approach to academia. It's not always true. The second way America shaped me was in the exposure. In the same university at Penn, more than Houston. Well, Houston, I took a class with Edward Albee. That was a huge thing. So that was amazing. He was teaching a course on writing. I just audited. Wow. So anyway, but coming to Penn, my father had a friend whose brother was a professor at Penn. His name was Arjuna Padre. He's an anthropologist. And so I remember doing my first year of economics. I hated economics in the first year. There's all this crazy math. We're just deriving equations, doing algebra, doing calculus. And I said, where are the human beings here? So I'm going to switch to anthropology because I already had an interest in anthropology. So I went to the anthropology department. Arjuna Padre happened to be the graduate chair of anthropology. He was already a professor. And I went and I'll never forget this, sitting in Arjun's office. I must have been, 1985, so I was 22. And I said, Arjun, I want to move. Of course, in India, never say Arjun. I want to move to anthropology. So he said, oh, tell me how you see the world. So I said, I see the world, but I think human beings are essentially rational actors. I, of course, my issue of not thinking of everything being human beings not able to shape their own lives. This idea of, in social sciences, in anthropology particularly, the notion of structure and agency, anthropologists really emphasize structure more than agency. In those days, it's sort of changed. And of course, there's a lot of that stuff going on. And at the end, I'm a liberal, liberal in the old sense, person. And I think he sensed that. And he said, you won't be happy here. He said, you'll take 6 years, 10 years to finish. You won't get a job at the end. It's tricky to get a job. He said, stay in economics, but be an anthropology spy in economics. That was his advice to me.
Wow.
And that is unforgettable advice. And to this day, I'm in touch with Arjun. Later on, we did many things together. But to this day, I would be grateful for that phrase because it shaped me. It gave me a direction. Said, okay, I'm going to tolerate this bloody first year, but I'm going to try within that to be an anthropologist.
All your World Bank colleagues are listening to this and saying, yeah, we knew it, Trojan horse.
We need to fire him. So it shaped me immeasurably coming to America. I've always been uncomfortable with the idea of being in American academia. I think in that sense, the World Bank is probably a better fit for me. But all I really wanted was to be a professor at the Delhi School or ISEC, I've spent a lot of time in these places since. I'm still very comfortable in these old-fashioned research institutes in the developing world, as they say. And I feel very comfortable in those places because that's where the people I respected lived. That's where they worked. So,
what are the kind of things that you then worked on, like during your PhD and after? How do you decide? Like I had an episode with Mukulika Banerjee, who did a PhD around the same time, in fact. And she said that when she asked her advisor, should I do a PhD or not? His advice to her was that if there is something that keeps you up at night and you can't stop thinking about it, then do a PhD, otherwise don't bother.
Absolutely right. I 100% agree with that. PhDs have now become more of like getting an MBA or something. You get a job.
Credentialism.
I don't think that's the right approach to a PhD. A PhD is a hard thing. I mean, one has to have a professor used to say, if you're happy to live on potatoes for 3 years, then do a PhD. Yeah. And yes, and to me, the first year was horrible. The second year, once I was able to work on my own ideas, work on my own research, and as I said, I had these tremendous people around me like Jerry and Anil, who allowed me to think very early on, and to, I was an apprentice to them in a sense. So what they did was what I absorbed. And then, I was struggling with how do I bring these anthropology ideas into economics. That was my struggle. And the first paper I wrote had nothing to do with that. I was a research assistant for a summer with this famous PPP project, the Purchasing Power Parity project, with these PPP numbers that I used to convert exchange rates to real terms. So I was working with Alan Heston and Robert Summers. Robert Summers is Larry Summers' father, as it happens. And as it happens, Kenneth Arrow's brother-in-law. That's a whole different story. So I was their research assistant for a summer. So I had access to all this PPP data that they had collected. And I noticed that there was all these data on the diets that people had, how much they spent on vegetables and meats. And I said, chalo, let me do. And I was also at that time doing my funding was from demography. So I had to take a class in demography, and I had the great Sam Preston as my demography professor. And my classmate there was a equally great Murray Bhatt, who then passed away. Anyway, so I made a lot of good friends. And Sam, his first big success in demography was looking at the effects of smoking on mortality. That was his classic work he did. So I said, hey, I'm going to look at the effects of diet on mortality. So I had all these data. I wouldn't ever write that kind of paper again. And I found that countries that had a greater proportion of vegetarian food in their diets had lower rates of mortality. Higher rates of infant mortality. So it was interesting, but lower rates of overall life expectancy. Lower mortality, higher life expectancy. So I remember taking that paper to Sam and him saying, and Sam smoking a cigar in his office. In those days, you could smoke. He said, you know what, what I did in my earlier work, I said, no, your work on smoking. Do you see me smoking? I said, yes. Are you a vegetarian? I said, no. Then I believe you. So, that whole atmosphere of being steeped in that, then making the link with Arjun in anthropology, and he encouraged me to attend all the seminars in the South Asia Center there. So I was exposed to all these great anthropologists, historians who came. Sanjay Subramaniam came, he came as a one-year visiting fellow when I was there. And we didn't have any history of thought requirement, but we have an economic history requirement. And this is an interesting story, now think about it. My choice was to study economic history with Claudia Golden. And I found that too bloody American. I was not interested in it. And I said, Sanjay is here. He's 2 years, 3 years older than me. He's already made a name for himself. And he's a very good pianist. He's got a lot of interest in jazz and stuff. And so he's got this notion of music. So we sort of became friends. We hung out. And I did a special course with him. Me and my friend Arup Banerjee, we both did our economic history with Sanjay Subramaniam.
Wow. So he had to create it just for you.
He created it as a tutorial. So he gave us things to read, and we would go to him, and I didn't do very well. I got an A-, but still, I don't think he liked my paper. I was trying to apply Dumont to growth or something. He didn't quite like what I did. But regardless, I had... It's only now, I think in one of your episodes, Ramchandra Guha calls him India's greatest historian. But I knew him when he was in his 20s, and he was still had made that famous name for himself. But the brilliance of the man steeped in. So it was I was very lucky, I think, then in that PhD. And then going to the University of Chicago, being in economics at the University of Chicago with exposure to all the great economists, Gary Becker, Sherwin Rosen, Jim Heckman, all these characters who were there, Robert Willis. At the same time, sitting in the South Asia Center. So there, Mickey Marriott, Singer, Barney Cohen, then getting exposed to Foucault and Bourdieu through that. Derrida was giving lectures, and I attended them. I couldn't understand a word, so I walked out. But anyway, I saw him speak, So all of this, and then I went to the University of Michigan. I didn't... Anyway, my job story is another story. But I ended up with another postdoc at Michigan. I was an adjunct professor in economics, and I was a Mellon postdoc. And that's where that postdoc gave me the funding, the money, because part of it was going to fieldwork. So that was my first fieldwork, was in my second job. That was around 92. That's when I did my first round of serious fieldwork. And, and that was also because I always tried to find these interdisciplinary opportunities, I think, from the beginning.
I want to talk about that fieldwork because what often happens is we go to university and we study things and we learn ideas and we build frames and we are floating in that abstract world in our heads, and then we enter the real world. And you've described beautifully that you were doing that fieldwork between 92 and 94, and at one point you were at a village talking to a group of local women, and suddenly one of their husbands entered the room and dragged her away and said, "How dare you be here when I'm waiting for lunch?" And later you learned that he used to beat her regularly, and later, after immersing yourself in that place for a few days, the women opened up to you and said things they weren't saying earlier, like our husbands beat us regularly and it's so bad. And, eventually you got a paper on domestic violence from that, but you and your co-author could not publish the paper as it was because it was both economics and anthropology, and you had to separate it into two separate papers. So tell me about that period of time and how it shaped you and what it made you feel about economics, what it made you feel about, on the one hand, the economics profession, but also on the other hand, the possibilities of using economics to understand the world.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. JSTOR started in Michigan. And when I went to Michigan, that was the early days of JSTOR. One of the first things they did was to put the top economics journals, economic journal called Economic Journal. There's a Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Review, and I think the Quarterly Journal of Economics, if I'm not mistaken. They were all online, going back to the 19th century. And I had access to them because I was faculty, right? And I started going back, reading all these articles, and I sort of realized economics profession is obsessed with publishing in what they call these top 5 journals. And that's shaping everybody around me. But when I read this stuff, I didn't make any calculation, maybe others have since, I don't know. And I'm making this number up, so think of it as a rhetorical number. About 5% of those ideas survive. 95% disappear. So it's great for your career, but nobody remembers that paper 5 years later. I said, what's the point of this? I just don't see why should I be struggling to publish in these places? Yes, maybe to make a career, but what's the point? At that point, I had a revise and resubmit at the Journal of Political Economy as it happened, which was my dowry paper from Chicago. And that was a struggle, It's like, it was, and I had to, anyway, all of us, every economist goes through that. But doing the field work, so I have a cousin, her name is Rama, who at that time ran an NGO called Mritya Khatika because she worked with potters in Karnataka. And that was my entry to the field. So I said, I'm coming to your villages. And, my Kannada is much better now. In those days, it wasn't that good. But she's completely fluent. And so I went with her. I just found a team of social workers and we went. And there was one man and there was the driver was a man. Otherwise, 4 of the people in the team were women. And there was Rama. He calls herself, I call her Rani. So Rani and I went with this team and she taught me how to enter the field. And if there is there's a theory of reflexivism, there's the practice of reflexivism, I think I got that from her. How do you enter in a spirit of humility, not in a spirit of superiority? You are encroaching their space. They're not privileged to have you there. Yeah. Because I was with an NGO, there was maybe something good stuff they got out of that, hopefully out of it. But that's not the approach you take. First time, I remember going and talking to a Dalit family, and it was early on, and being invited in to have a meal. And clearly they didn't have much, but they were sharing whatever they had because they were visitors from the outside, just being generous. Yeah. And by the way, every caste doing that. That happened to the Dalit family, but a Brahmin family would do the same thing. So that hospitality, and that really, I sort of realized this is a whole world with which I'm unfamiliar and I'm presuming to study these people. So let me, my friends will tell you I like to talk, as we are noticing in this conversation as well. I had to learn to listen. And that's what Rama taught me, is that learn to listen. Now, the particular instance you're talking about, I was going there to study marriage markets because that's what my paper on dowries was. And so I said, okay, let me understand marriage markets from the field, from the ground up. And I was going to study dowries and all that sort of stuff. But in the process of studying it, this particular instance that you're talking about, when this woman was beaten in front of me, because in effect I was talking to her, or we were talking to her, really hit me hard. And I said, 2 things hit me. One is this violence is rampant, violence against women. And secondly, my own presence can sometimes cause it. Okay, but it turned me into start making that the focus of that particular project. And then there were other things that we studied, festivals, I studied price variation, all that came, these are ideas that came from the field. But the instance that you talked about where they started opening up after a week of listening to them, talking to them, because and basically having their namak, we sat and had food with them. They cooked for us, we brought food to them. That exchange of food was very important in opening them up, and then of course having arak with them, it was very funny. It was a small digression. One of the women social workers in my team, she was from one of the Karnataka tribes. So I remember sitting in the evening, we would have these meetings in the evening, we would discuss the field, what we found, making notes and stuff. And I had never had arak in my life at that point. So anybody has arak? So does anybody know what it tastes like? So everybody's saying no. Then slowly this woman, she says in Kannada, "Nanagu gottide, I know." I said, "Really? What does it taste like?" And she was looking around. Solpa majji ke tarah. It's a little bit like buttermilk. So, those little moments of, one thing I think I was brought up by both my parents, at least as a child, is don't treat anybody differently than anything. So that's always been part of, at least I try. But I think learning, it's not some false notion of humility or I'm not a humble person. And it is about not thinking that you're better than anybody else by definition of who you are. If you approach the field in that way, with, again, keeping Taylor's notion of the politics of recognition, and the same thing with the Gram Sabha, people open up. I think we Indians are so conditioned by status, by trying to compete on status. We are conditioned that way because of the caste system. I'm reading a beautiful book on Buddhism now, and I'm realizing, how when you come up with a Indian philosophy that lacks caste, how it can look, what can get. I'm sure that's what appealed to Ambedkar. But the idea of caste is so deeply ingrained in us that we're always competing to be better than the other person, more than other primates, I think. Yeah, all primates have it. Indians have it the worst. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, I think the Ambani wedding has shown us that. But the understanding how lives that are very different from mine work, the logic that applies to them is different from my logic, where this idea that you cannot choose who you marry. I mean, we all hear about arranged marriage, but there are different degrees of arranged marriage. Yeah, these young women were getting married at 12, 13, 14, sterilized by 17 because they've had their 2 children. And then after they get sterilized, husbands start getting jealous, thinking they're being unfaithful. So that results in one of the causes of violence was women being sterilized. Yeah, things like this. And then with my history with my mother, realizing that, firstly, gender is a very complicated thing, but women are placed in positions that make them bear the brunt of society's problems. I mean, that came across very, very, very clearly. So that sort of shaped the kind of work I did for the next 10, 15, 20 years after that. It was a transforming experience going to the field, and I've tried to do it ever since. I do it much less now because I try, but I do it less. Yeah.
A beautiful phrase I learned from your work, in fact, is Mario Small's phrase cognitive empathy, which is of, being able to understand someone else's predicament as they understand it. And you've posited that it's one of the 4 things that economics should learn from ethnography. And we'll talk about the others later, but I'm just curious about what this depth of insight can add to what an economist might otherwise get. Like an economist studying the same village or whatever, they would look at data that is at a much more surface level. They would draw different kinds of conclusions. A lot of people would say that what your cognitive empathy gets you is a subjective and impressionistic view of a situation. You cannot extrapolate from it what is the value. That is how an econometrics person may think of it. And yet I totally buy your point that it can just add layers of insight into a situation. So can you give me examples of this where, the econometrician's view would fail because it did not take the particular into account, and that particular suddenly, added those layers to it?
I'll give you 3 examples, but let me first start with the non-economics. It's not just economists. It's anybody who works with data that somebody else has collected or has collected data in a way that is not cognitively empathetic. Yeah. Let's stick with domestic violence. I told you when I went to the field, I felt that my interview with this woman instigated an instance of violence. I saw that in front of me. The majority of since then, domestic violence has become IPV, as they call it, has become a huge field. Everybody studies it. The DHS, in India, it's called the NHFS. All over the world, they collect data on domestic violence. In India, they collect it from a huge sample, 10, 20,000 households. But they're asking women these very sensitive questions. I find that, it brings me to a Nuremberg ethics kind of problem, How much violence have you caused by asking these questions in an insensitive way? Just send some enumerator and throw that question in. Firstly, I don't know what nonsense data you're collecting. Secondly, look at the ethical implications. The UN, by the way, has a beautiful set of criteria that how you collect these kinds of data. They pretend to, I bet you with a sample of 20,000, you cannot do that. And they're doing it all over the world. They don't have the resources for that. That is deeply cognitively unempathetic, right? So I don't trust any work done with domestic violence, interpersonal violence, with that data set. And it's the most used data set all over the world to what we know about this. When you look at numbers, incidences, everything we know, it's from DHS data. I don't trust it on this subject. Other things, they're all right. So what we try to do, and I don't want to say myself because it was the entire team that collected the data, was to listen And because of that, you said we had to split the papers because the paper that it was under my name that I published in the Social Science and Medicine on this, found 3 or 4 different things. One was, of course, dowries. The second one was this female sterilization and the sort of, it was almost became a marking event, that idea of the woman getting sterilized at some very young age because they were incentivized to get sterilized and there was a family planning program going on. So there was puberty, there was marriage, there was sterilization as marking events in a woman's life. Yeah. And her life really changed after that.
And seminal marking moments all before she's out of her teens. That's insane.
Out of her teens. And that was clearly there. Alcoholism, a huge cause. And I mean, the rampant alcoholism. There's Arak I was talking about. Yes, maybe all get around over a beer or a glass of wine and become more sociable as a result of that.
Does it taste like buttermilk?
It does. So, but what they would do was to get it in these plastic packets, some racket that the government used to run, and it was a huge source of revenue for the government. And it was everywhere, and that was also the time, it's still the case, where you had a lot of unemployed youth because they would get their stupid whatever so-called degrees and not find jobs, and they had to come back to farming or some sort of wage labor that everybody else was doing, and they felt they were above that. So they would get drunk, they would gamble, they would get drunk. Addictions and how it affected, this was clearly there and affected domestic violence. The inability of women to fight it, to counter it, except if there was one case, we were in a place that was in a monastery where the head monk did something about it, and that changed. That was, he was a Lingayat monk. So unless they had that backing from some more powerful source, they would be facing the brunt of these things. So that, whole inequality wouldn't have been, you can read about structures of patriarchy and all of that, but you really can't get at that without getting to the ground. Yeah? So that's just one example on domestic violence. Let's go to a positive example. Think of NREGA. Where does NREGA come from? And people have talked about this, of course. I'm not saying anything that others don't know. That was because Jean is the most cognitively empathetic economist I know. He lives what he talks. Yeah. So he came up with it because he felt that this would work. Of course, he knew the history of wage for labor programs, guaranteed income programs in India and other parts of the world. And he said, okay, let's try this out. So that is good policy, you could argue, coming out of cognitive empathy. So there's a positive aspect to that. Let's talk about, so many, all these RCTs that are done, slowly changing, but not there, where they find an impact on a question that they're interested in. The question is not emerging from the ground. It's what can I get published? What does my advisor tell me? Whoever you talk to, 90% of RCTs are done by people who are trying to get published. Okay? Or they're trying to evaluate a program because the World Bank has told them that to evaluate it. That's the other reason. They find an impact. They have no clue where that impact came from. We have this, this Falana intervention has this 20% improvement in something. And that tells us that it works. That'll be the sort of gist of the thing. Mechanisms, as they say, you have to do some, you may or may not have the data to sort of try to look at what correlates with that, what interaction term will tell you something. What actually happened, you never know. And they'll come up with some big theoretical model that might tell you something. Why don't you follow up with people, talk to them, ask them how that process worked? That's qualitative work. That's cognitively empathetic. You'd find slowly it's coming in. I think I'm noticing some papers doing more of that. Chris Blattman, there's some others doing this kind of work. For the most part, it's not most part. For the vast majority of papers, it's not there. Yeah, it's, if research came more out of the ground, it would not be paternalistic. It would be reflexive. Whether it's an RCT or whatever else, that's the part that I wish would change a little bit more. Similarly with policy, when I joined the World Bank, the reason I joined, among many other reasons, there was a president called Jim Wolfenson, that was just after structural adjustment, and he was a huge critic of the World Bank, and he said, I'm going to come and fix it. Arrogant man, Australian guy. He was Olympic fencer. He was a multi-millionaire, billionaire kind of guy, and he took $1 a year as salary, had his private plane. He was a character. But he came in having read all the anthropologists who had critiqued the World Bank. He came in with that knowledge, I'm going to fix it. How did he fix it? He said, I'm going to hire people who follow this approach. So he brought in Robert Chambers, he brought in all that crowd, and he created the opportunity for people like me to be hired. My friend Michael Woolcock was a sociologist. We were all hired, Monica Dasgupta. We were all hired at the same time, in the research department. And he insisted that any new person who comes to the World Bank has to spend at least 1 week in the home of a family of a project that the World Bank is trying to target. So people went to Gujarat, they stayed in Seva, they went to, I remember somebody went to Ghana, somebody went to Colombia, Bolivia. They would live in these houses, come back with a transformed understanding. My God, this is nothing like what I learned in my textbooks, right? That's all eroded, by the way. That's all gone. We are back to the old-fashioned world of structural, the world that used to do structural adjustment. I don't know what's going to do now, but it's not an empathetic world. Yeah, that's considered too costly. It's considered not necessary. Everybody wants to go really super fast. So that's a different world that we're in. But that was a good moment in big development, I think.
Just thinking aloud, it strikes me that, research done without this kind of cognitive empathy is possibly not just as good as it could be, it is also unethical, in the sense that when a researcher is doing a study based on an extraneous reason, like this will get me published or my supervisor will approve of this, they are essentially using the people in their study as a means to an end. Kant's categorical imperative, never treat people as a means to an end but as an end in themselves. And that is a cornerstone of morality as per Kant. And it strikes me that they're just doing that, and it feels almost evil that from the top down you are researching people and doing all of these studies on people when you don't actually give a damn about the people themselves or give them the respect or the agency, which a different kind of study would, where the questions would emerge from them and would be reflexive.
I may not use those adjectives. I think people are well-intentioned. If you go into development economics, you're generally well-intentioned. Why would you do this? It's not the easiest road. And there's been a lot of attention paid to the ethics of doing this by people like Rachel Gilnester and others. They've written about all of these things. But yes, actually, in some ways, RCTs have had a good impact, in the sense of at least they have to collect their own data. In my day, when I got my PhD, nobody collected their own data, right? You just use somebody's data, else's data. So at least they have to go to the field, whether they like it or not. Every young development economist you find, I don't care what race they are, where they're from, they would have spent some time in the field because they have to go collect data. The question is, do they do it reflexively? Do they do it with cognitive empathy? No, I don't think that's the case at all, because they won't get, even if they want to, they don't get rewarded for it. Yeah. In fact, they might even get punished for it because it's a waste of time. The paper doesn't come out as fast. That is, I think, an incentive problem, and it goes back to our earlier conversation about how disciplines are structured. So I would hesitate to pass judgment, but I would rather say, please change, because you're doing something that could be done much better. So I think I would like to phrase it that way, perhaps.
No, I was just thinking aloud, and I'm allowed to be harsh. It's okay. I don't work in the World Bank. So other points you make of what economics can learn from ethnography besides cognitive empathy is narrative economics, where where you take words seriously, not just numbers. Break this down for me, because a typical view of someone who deals in the numbers is that, numbers at least appear to be, from a vantage point, they appear to be reliable. They are what they are. But words, they can just be anecdotes. They can be subjective. They can miss a point. You decide what words you want to listen to. So, and Schiller, of course, has a book on this called Narrative Economics, as you pointed out. Tell me a little bit about this aspect of it and how you came to recognize its importance.
The analysis of words, the analysis of text. Let me start with a negative thing. It can be just as unreflexive as quantitative data. So what's happened basically is the computer scientists and the linguists for now 20 years have over time developed enormously powerful methods to analyze text. Yeah, they're called text as data methods. Natural language processing is the more technical term. Part of machine learning, if you wish. So there are lots of papers in many disciplines being written on this. It's a very fast-growing field. My little sort of part in this is to argue, can we start using the analysis of text in a way that is reflexive? The challenge with ethnography and economics from the beginning, and it goes back to Charles Booth, has been interested in large numbers. They're not interested in small studies because they want to influence policy. With policy, you need to be representative of the population you're studying. So there's a problem of statistical representativeness that economists have been obsessed with from the beginning. Of course, you cannot be reflexive with that size of things. So in my early work, it was about combining things. That is, I'm going to do my qualitative work in a small sample and then see if the quantitative data can generalize from that. Get the ideas from the hypothesis, test it with larger data. That is the way I try to resolve that particular. I did, others have done it, and otherwise that's the way I did. What these development of these new techniques have taught me, at least, is to say, let us try to do qualitative work at scale with representative samples. So that's the big leap. We don't have to do this with small samples. So then, how do we make it reflexive? So what we tried to do during COVID, and because my wife and I were together in COVID in DC, and we were doing everything virtually like everybody else was, we had the opportunity to do phone interviews in Bangladesh with Rohingya refugees and their Bangladeshi hosts in Cox's Bazar. We got some funding for this. There was some interest. So I said, okay, this is our opportunity to, at least on the phone, let's do open-ended interviews. Let's not ask these hard questions. We will ask one question and then have a conversation like you're doing, very much along these lines, and probably not for this long, where we'll train interviewers so they're able to ask these responsive questions, listening to people responding, asking other questions, probing. Yeah. And Monica, my wife, runs a qualitative research firm called Qual Analytics that tries to teach people how to do these things. So she trained them and her team trained them. And we asked, with a sample of, I think it was 2,300 representative of Cox's Bazar, divided equally between Rohingya refugees and Bangladeshi hosts. The first set of questions we asked them about parents' aspirations for their children. What do they want their children to be when they grow up? And I've had an interest in aspirations for a very long time. I mentioned Arjuna Padre. I did a book, started working on it in 2002, finished in 2004, called Culture and Public Action, the edited volume. Arjun wrote an article there called The Capacity to Aspire, which has become a super hit, that article. And he wrote it partly because Mike Walton and I had many, many conversations with him about it was his way of trying to think about sense capabilities and saying, what can an anthropologist say? So he did that article. And him and Debra J also did some work in parallel on looking at aspirations and so on. So there's a lot of interest in this subject, but I felt that it's taken a very economics angle, the aspirations literature, because they're looking at very specifically goals. So Agnes Callard, the philosopher, has got a book on aspirations, where she, by the way, neither cites a Padre or Ray or anybody. So it's her own trip, right? Which I wrote to her. I hope she's read it now. But Callard distinguishes between goals and other types of aspirations. So, and the economics literature and aspirations about goals. So how much education you want your kids to have, what job you want, what salary they want to have. Rather than, I want my kid to be a good person. And a Padre's take on aspirations is, all this is fine, but how are you going to get there? What he calls the capacity to aspire. It's a capability. And he says that capability is unequally distributed. So the notion of capability and the notion of Callardian aspirations, there was no data on. And I felt qualitative work could give us these things, while quantitative can give us the goals. So let's combine them. So that was the first set of questions we asked. What do you want kids to be? Goal question. How are you going to get there? So that was the capacity question. And then, and from that, we use these text as data techniques to sort out what the determinants of each of these are. Now, the big innovation in that paper, I think, is that we developed a set of tools that allowed us to do this more reflexively. Now, what do I mean by that? Firstly, the open-ended questions are, at least in a marginal sense, more reflexive than a structured question. But secondly, the techniques that exist in machine learning to do this are what are called supervised or unsupervised. Supervised techniques rely on a dictionary, like a sentiment dictionary, and they look at sentiments. It's some dictionary that comes out of somewhere else. Unsupervised is the computer will go through it and come up with topics and tell you, hey, this is what the kinds of categories of things people are talking about. Both useful tools, and I've used them in other work. None of them are sociological. How a sociologist does qualitative work is that you go and collect all that data from the field, then you'll sit and you stare and read and start coding start to summarize that what you're reading in certain set of codes. You have a coding tree, and then with that coding tree, you construct a narrative of what that's saying. That's a very inductive process you don't see in this work, and that's more reflexive. How do we then develop a method that we can do sociological coding of this sort, sensitive, reflexive coding, but do it at scale? So that's the nut we've cracked in some ways, because our simple solution was the training set we will use will be with a subsample of, in our case, 400 interviews that we will have trained sociologists read and code like they would do any other standard type of qualitative work. There's a much smaller sample. And then we will use machine learning to expand that codes to the full set. Okay, so that's the crux of the method. We call it iQual. So that was, I guess, trying to take that text as data and make it more reflexive. Right? Now, my colleagues and I, we had another chance to collect data. So we asked questions on well-being. We asked them 2 questions. What is your notion of the good life? And then we asked them to, actually 3 questions. A question on a Cantrell ladder that is a score of 1 to 5, happiness survey. How happy are you? And then the third question, why did you pick that number? So the first question, the last question are open-ended. So we really get a rich sense of their understanding of well-being. We're still in the process of analyzing that. That's work I need to finish, and we all need to finish. So what I want to do with that, and that's really been my goal. I'm now heading off in a different direction. I don't know if this is of interest. Let me stop there.
No, actually go on. Yeah, we'll come back to this. You go on.
Okay, so I want to talk about well-being a bit and take your question and apply it to well-being and welfare. Welfare is a term, Leon Waldrop goes back even further. I mean, if you read Tom Holland, not the actor, Tom Holland, the historian, his book Dominion, I think it's called, he makes it very clear how deeply all of us have notions that emerge from the Bible ingrained in what we do. I think welfare is one of those concepts. I don't mean this is bad. I mean, it's great, but it's about finding out who's deserving through data, through a conception of what welfare is, and then doing something to help them, right? So that's what then, since Leon Waldrop, that's turned into is utility theory, and Bentham, of course, which means that we are going to see what matters in a utility function and what people are maximizing, and then use that to then derive, say, notions of how well people are doing, how much utility they have, what trade-offs they make, and of course, then emerging from that, notions of things like the poverty line come, right? And so the poverty line obsession is there are literally millions of dollars spent measuring poverty lines around the world. And I am the center of that, not because I do it, but because next to me for 20 years was Martin Rebellion, who's the big guru of this. It was interesting. When I joined my department, I had Martin Rebellion on one side of my office, Branko Milanovic in the other. So I had both these folks. And Martin was my boss also, so it is deeply influential. Tremendous man. Anyway, that's another story. But I found this deeply troubling, this way of measuring poverty, partly because when I was back doing my fieldwork with the domestic violence stuff, one of the things I noticed, which is pretty obvious, is that poor people were paying more for the same products than rich people, mainly because they were buying things in tiny quantities. So they would get 100 grams of dal rather than a kg of dal. And the unit price was about 40% higher when they did that. So I collected data on all of that, and I wrote a paper with that. And once you have prices varying for the same good, not for different goods. It's not like you're buying better rice and I'm buying poorer rice. You're buying the same, whatever, jaggery say, but I'm paying more for it than you because I'm poorer than you. That screws up the whole idea of a poverty line. Because if you and I face different prices, then what line are you going to use? You have to adjust it to those prices, right? So what I found when you did that adjustment, poverty is actually much higher, inequality is much higher. So I started, and of course it results in not a poverty line, but a poverty schedule. It gets much more complicated. There's no such thing as a line. And then I discovered there are many you could use many critical lenses on this, multidimensionality. Why should it only mean poverty lines emerge from actually the nutritional thing? What is the minimum amount of food necessary so you can have a day's work? That's Dandekar and Rath. That's all of this comes from there. But then Sukhatme, there's a whole debate in the EPW from the 70s, but Sukhatme comes and says, Dandekar and Rath, you have this line. I have done experiments with women making chapatis. Actually, there's a whole debate in the EPW is fascinating. And I find that if they're starved, and they eat less food over time, and they have much more uncertain food consumption, their metabolism becomes much more efficient. So if you're hungry, you're actually able to process more energy from the same amount of food. Okay? I think that's one reason Indians become fat. Our ancestors used to be constantly starving. So, anyway, but that metabolic critique also then affects the notion of a line. The line might be, in fact, you might have two people, one of them is much poorer than the other, but the nutritional criteria they need is less. That's kind of ethically screwed up, right? So I said, hell, and then of course the happiness work, that's a whole different, that's not from economics, that's from psychology, Halper and all these guys. That work, basically, can you believe this? I come to you and I say, Amit, on a score of 1 to 10, how happy are you? You say, I'm 7. And I'll say, I'm 4. I mean, okay, then you say, you're happier than me. The threshold might be different, no, between you and me. I mean, if I'm a depressive person, my 4 might be because I'm a depressive person. Actually, my life is just as good as yours, but I perceive it as worse. How do you account for that? So you have this, the Finns are the happiest people in the world. Somebody else is the most miserable. All of these methods of measuring well-being are screwed up. Also because the philosophy behind them comes from elsewhere. So I said, it's pretty obvious to say that why don't we understand people's well-being from their definition of what well-being is? That's reflexive. Like, if I sit with you, I mean, you've sat with me now for some hours, as you've done with so many others, you have a real sense of the person. If you ask me, and which you haven't, what makes a good life for me, I've given you some hints on that, but maybe there's more I can say, and you go from there to measure it, then we get a better sense of what matters to me, right? Now, certain things will be, of course, non-negotiable. Having some income, having a lack of debt, I mean, these matter to everybody. Education, these matter to everybody, right? And those are quantitative, those can be quantitatively done. So what we're trying to do with this is to sort of say, if we ask people open-ended questions of what they define well-being, can we find from this some way of understanding, perhaps even measuring well-being that is more ground up? So that's the perspective around it. And that's so, again, these new methods that exist give us this opportunity to do it at scale.
So what you're saying is that you can do this kind of large language processing and actually get insight into this particular question.
Yes. So that's what we're attempting to do. We've certainly done it with aspirations already. In fact, that aspirations work has shown clearly that goals matter, but some people, really more than the goals, they want their kids to be good people. And of course, in Bangladesh, many of them are very devout Muslims. It comes from an Islamic perspective, what that good person is. Those matter. The idea that somehow welfare should be divorced from religion is stupid, or spirituality, or some ethical frame. It makes no sense, right? It's a point, of course, Sen is made, but even Sen insists on the economic definition of welfare. Capabilities, functionings, yes, but at the end, it's all at the end boils down to certain numbers. Why not let people decide? Let them tell you, right?
And what have you found so far in terms of how differently people define well-being?
So, as I said, one is the importance that people give. So people give a lot of importance to goals. There's no question about it. That does matter. But they also give importance to wanting their kids to be good people. And that good person, for the Rohingya particularly, and for the Bangladeshis, hosts, is from a sense of someone who is able to regulate their needs. That comes out very, very clearly. We should not want more.
So the definitions of good would also vary according to...
Would vary, and so that also matters. There's a lot more work we can do on this, but this is the stuff we have got. If I was going to do this again, I would not do phone interviews. I would do it. The second thing, and that's in some ways has policy implications, is that the capacity to know how to navigate your way towards the ambitions you have for those kids is very different. It varies a lot. Yeah. And it really helps. There's a perpetuation of inequality when you have an educated parent. I mean, we've been talking about my life. Clearly, I'm shaped by the fact that I was privileged to be born into this world where all these people were there who I was able to... So I'm able to navigate. What if I was not able to navigate, right? What if I wanted to be some kind of interdisciplinary economist from somewhere, but I had no clue how to get there? Yeah, I think so just in my case, the fact that I'm able to have this weird career is because I have a lot of cultural and social capital that I'm able to exploit. What if I didn't? What can policy do about that? Can we bring that to people? So that's what that capability question gives us. And there's no question that it matters a lot and is, as Apadre says, unequally distributed.
And at some level, do capacities also determine your goals? Because it's a different matter that you wouldn't have been able to achieve the goal without the social and cultural capital. But you may not have had the goal in the first place if you weren't there.
Right. So on education, we find that that's not the case. Because, I mean, you go to any poor part of India, you'll find a lot of kids and a lot of parents saying, I want my kid to be a doctor. I mean, whatever, because social media, movies, they make everybody aware of what the ambitions can be. I'm sure if most Indians will tell you they want a wedding like Ambani. I mean, whether they're going to do it or not is another story. They try. It's other work of mine. But, so I don't think those aspirations are necessarily, I mean, they could be, but they're not. Yeah. Well-being maybe, notions of well-being maybe, but aspirations, I find people can say all kinds of things.
I think the Ambani wedding has spanned like 50 episodes of mine because it just goes on and on. Pre-wedding, post-wedding.
$600 million, I understand. But
Jesus, incredible. Okay. So, your other two instances of what economics can learn from ethnography are the notion of process, participation, many of which you've alluded to indirectly in this, and I'll just encourage everyone to read your paper. Here's a question. Supposing you do this, you have the cognitive empathy, you go down, you spend time with the people who you're studying. Is there a danger that you could get too tied up in the proximate? Right? For example, Jean Drèze's example, right? If you have that cognitive empathy for the people around you, then, coming up with NREGA is a natural thing and you can see the good it does. At the same time, if for people who see the bigger picture, they might say that number one, welfare creates dependencies and that's a bad thing. A friend of mine has a phrase for this called PPP, perpetually planned poverty, which is also a critique of socialism. Equally, you could say this has a crowding out effect at a time where jobs are the need of the hour and it's not really sustainable. Another example to move away from NREGA is, say, farm loan waivers. If you're hanging out with farmers themselves, the immediate anesthetic they need for their visceral pain that they feel in their lives is certainly farm loan waivers. But it may not be visible to a researcher in the field with the farmers that there's a different kind of structural reform needed entirely, which is not perceptible because you're too close to the problem. And in a sense, this is also a question about the trade-off between a view that is too broad and from too much of a distance, like multinational multilateral organizations like World Bank, etc. might have, where they only look at the data from a distance. And, the other part of the trade-off where you're really too close and you can't see the bigger picture and extrapolate.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. But only point I'm making is one is dominant, super dominant, the other one is non-existent.
Yeah.
So there has to be some balance. Yeah. When you just have one view dominating, that's also wrong. And that results in screwed up policy. But otherwise, your point is very well taken. The thing with say something, I mean, so let me make a slightly different point. I think, and this is not a point I make in the paper, but you've made me think about this. The principle of subsidiarity.
Yeah.
That principle of subsidiarity should apply to research and what we learn from research as well. So I think, and if you start applying that, that treat knowledge with the respect it deserves for the level at which it is coming from. That doesn't mean you don't do macro stuff, you don't do meso stuff or micro stuff. All of them matter. But we need to get away from saying that the macro, the kind of attention paid to macroeconomists in the world and in India bothers me. I wanted to be a macroeconomist. I studied with Lawrence Klein. I did all of this. I studied expectation rational. I was at Chicago with Robert Lucas. I know this stuff, right? I found it stupid. Because at the end, the principles, whatever math you use, the principles are ABC, Why do Indians give so much attention to every damn macroeconomist, chief economist, this, that, economic, all macroeconomists, when this work is much harder and more interesting? So I'm saying that bit in jest, but it's sort of, all of them matter. All of them have to be paid attention to in making policy. Yeah.
That's a fantastic insight. For those of my listeners who don't know the principle of subsidiarity, it basically is that if you look at the structure of governments, each thing should be done at the level of government at which it is best done. So if you have like water supply and plumbing problems, it is a local government, the village government or the city government which should do that. If you have something like defense, for example, that a national government has to do. So, whatever can be done, you do it basically as locally as it is possible. And the point you're making is that when it comes to research, it's the same thing. So if I might think aloud, when it comes to understanding well-being in a particular area, you want to do reflexive ethnographic study to understand what people themselves mean by well-being, and that's the only way to do it. It has to be at the most local level. But when you look at a larger structural level of how can you bring about economic prosperity in that area, then maybe you need to take a broader view.
That's one way of seeing it. I mean, and I think the work I'm trying to do now is to see if we can raise the level at which we understand how people see well-being to a more macro level. So maybe technology allows us to sort of do different things with that subsidiarity.
The granular understanding can finally scale.
Yes.
Wow, that's incredible. What have you found? Like, you've done papers also on using LLMs for this kind of stuff of parsing language, especially when it comes to the oral transcripts you have from Gram Sabhas, participation of women in them, participation of Dalits in them. So what have you found using machine learning in areas like that?
Yeah, so LLMs is a slightly different story. I'll tell you what we've done, and that's slightly different. But with machine learning, we use something called topic modeling, which is old-fashioned, unsupervised methods from Texas data to study Gram Sabhas. I did that with Ramya Parthasarathi and Netra Palniswamy in Tamil Nadu. And, we approached it that way because of a practical reason. Paramit and I collected our data on Gram Sabhas, the 300 Gram Sabhas in South India. I collected it first. Paramita joined me the project later. But that was old-fashioned, hand-done qualitative analysis. It took us, between life's ups and downs for her and me, it took us 8 or 9 years to analyze all that. And then I had the chance to collect some data, Gram Sabha data from Tamil Nadu, because of a project we were doing. I said, this is crazy. I don't want to do this. So I said, I learned something. I didn't know anything about machine learning in those years. I said, this has to be a method. So I approached a friend of mine at Stanford, Soumitra Jha, I mentioned. They said, hey, Som, come and do this with me. You're smarter guy than me. You can probably figure this out. I don't know anything about machine learning. But there's this kid I know, Ramya Parthasarathi, in political science. She's studying these things. Why don't you work with her? She's also looking for a topic. So Ramya and I joined together with Netra. Netra helped, of course, managed all the data collection. And the method used there was topic modeling, which is basically, we had all these transcripts, I think 100 transcripts. And the computer goes in, sorts all that data out into bags of words, it's called. So in our case, we experimented how many bags, we settled on 20. But then the human interpretation comes. The computer will give you bags of words. You have to stare at those bags. What's the meaning of these words? Thankfully, I know a lot about Gram Sabha, so that helped. So staring at it, I kind of was able to interpret what those are saying. And then we did various regressions with that. We found some very interesting things. In that paper, we found that there's no question that there's an enormous amount of citizen participation, but that men are listened to much more than women. And so there is gender bias. But that gender bias is rectified when you have women presidents. Oh. So women presidents listen to women more, and that corrects their gender balance. So that was the summary of a reasonably complicated paper. The LLM story is slightly different. So the LLMs are a technique that's also in the Texas data family, and I think an entire world has already started and will increasingly get dominated by LLMs. I like to think of them as a version of supervised learning, but we don't know what the training set is. Even LLM people don't know what the training set is because it's training on everything. So it's some form of collective knowledge, if you wish, that's being distilled and it's going mad. Yeah. The particular issue Julian Ashwin and I and our co-authors, Aditya Chhabra, were interested in is for our Rohingya Bangladesh data, which was firstly the Rohingya dialect, the Rohingya language is, I understand, very close to the Chittagongian dialect of Bangla, right? So there's already a step of translation that the person who's been doing these interviews is then putting that into regular Bengali. And then, of course, the Bangladeshi is being regular Bengali. Now, we can analyze the Bengali text directly with machine learning. You don't need to translate it. We take that additional step so we can read that data. So that's there, because I don't read Bengali, and neither do my colleagues. Then we use our method of bottom-up coding training set, where the sociologists have sat and coded everything, and then we're coming with a dictionary, we're coming with codes. That's our method, a reflexive method. But there's a literature starting in computer science. There was an article in PNAS that at that time, there are many others now, saying that LLMs can do this for you automatically. Yeah, you just let the LLM in, it'll do the coding for you. LLMs do programming anyway, so why can't do this kind of coding, qualitative coding also? And why waste our time doing human coding? LLMs will do it for you. So somehow found this quite bothersome. So Julian and Aditya, I should give credit to them, then basically applied these LLM coding methods and our coding method that we had developed using our iQual method, and found that the LLM coding was massively biased. So we put it as a working paper. It's got a revised resubmit in a good sociological methods and research now. We've got a lot of pushback from computer scientists saying this is because you're looking at these Bangladeshis and Rohingyas. If you look at our kind of people, you're fine. And also, second criticism, this is early LLMs. Let ChatGPT 5 come, 6 come, it'll be much better. This is probably true, but at least at this point, it's a cautionary tale. Don't think LLMs are, some magic solution. They are not. They can be, in fact, severely biased when they're looking at people that LLMs are not trained to look at particularly. So don't use them for this purpose. Our method is better also.
So, you mentioned your work with Paromita. You've got a book, Oral Democracy, with her, published, I think, in 2018. You'd written a book previously called Localizing Development with Ghazala Mansouri. Here's a digressive question on the subject of books and knowledge, which is that how does an intellectual think about their role in society beyond the particular, mandate of knowledge creation that you have within the World Bank? So you work for the research department of the World Bank, you do what you do there. Many other people may work in universities or various places and they're creating knowledge. What is the responsibility for getting the knowledge out there in an accessible way? Because I'm guessing that if you think the knowledge and the insights matter, it almost becomes something also your duty to kind of get it out there in a way that people can understand. Whereas a lot of the academic world is a little bit of a circle jerk. It's academics speaking to other academics in journals that only academics read, if anyone reads them, in language that only other academics can understand if they are read at all. Do you think that in a sense, there's a larger role to be played for people within this knowledge society, that there's a larger responsibility out there of getting these ideas out there at scale, of building a body of work? Like, I have recently sort of been using the economic concepts of stock and flow and thinking about intellectual endeavors, where I think papers and blog posts and articles are really a sort of flow of content. They are necessary. That is how you constantly make yourself think better. You throw them against the real world. You get feedback. It's super important, but it's transient. Hardly anybody notices. It comes and it goes, specifically if you're in academia. Maybe World Bank reports also translate into policy, but otherwise they're not really read widely. And I think of the stock of intellectual content as being maybe things like books or documentary series like Friedman's Free to Choose or whatever, but they last longer. That issue of transience isn't there, and it becomes something that others can build on. They can be foundational. I love Philip Larkin's phrase, it deepens like a coastal shelf. It's in a different context. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. But, just as intergenerational misery can build up like that, so does knowledge. You provide one sedimentary layer of understanding. On top of that, there's another layer. All of your work and your knowledge is based on many layers from different places, from economics, from sociology, from ethnography. So your layers are different from other people's layers, but those layers are there. Do you feel that intellectuals in general, have this responsibility to think about it in this way, that a lot of intellectual work, if not intellectual energy to begin with, because you're asking the wrong questions and doing chasing the wrong goals, but A, is a lot of that wasted, and B, whenever good work is done, you also have a responsibility to think about that coastal shelf and what you're contributing.
Absolutely. And I I take this much more seriously the older I get. We come back to this notion of incentives. Academics, researchers, whether the World Bank or outside, we are rewarded by publishing. At the World Bank, we're rewarded, I think it's slightly better because we're also rewarded for our impact on policy. But at the end, it's a game. It's a game of how can I take this data, collect this data, construct it in a way that will get me to the highest possible journal. Yeah, that's the game. And if you look at all the famous economists, they've all made their careers playing that game very well. They all publish in the top 5. They're obsessed with publishing in the top 5. Any good, well-known economist has done that. I think any kind of academic has done that. Now, to me, the impact that has outside academic circles is derived in the sense of derived demand. It is one particular idea might take off, somebody might resonate with that, they might do something with it. Now, the RCT world has had a great impact on this. I mean, so that's both good and bad, for the reasons we discussed. Everybody's obsessed with deworming now because of the original RCT work of Ted Miguel and Michael Kramer. I mean, everybody's obsessed with microfinance and what is this? The kind of programs that they're starting doing in BRAC and others because it's passed the RCT test. So that is having actually a policy impact without needing to be translated, because the translation is very simple. Our impact was so much. If you do this, you get this. There is a challenge, though, in how you synthesize all of that into a body of work and sort of say, how do we understand this as big picture? The kind of work I work on is bottom-up stuff broadly, which is particularly tricky because it's a multidisciplinary literature. It's also looking at not simple but complex interventions. So deworming is very simple. I mean, like a headache, it's a simple intervention. You give a pill, somebody's better off. That is very amenable to an RCT because the intervention doesn't vary depending on the person you're giving to. The body may vary, but not the intervention. In bottom-up stuff, every bloody village is different. The interventions could be slightly different everywhere, right? So Ghazala's book that book that Ghazala Mansouri and I did, Localizing Development, was an attempt to say the bank at that time was spending $80 billion or something on bottom-up development. So we said, what is the evidence on this? And very consciously we said, we're not going to go just for this RCT evidence because RCTs have a limitation in studying this because the intervention varies. If the intervention varies, effectively the RCT is underpowered, as they say, has less sample than it needs. Always, you're going to find no impact because you don't have enough data. So we have to be a much broader interpretation of this. And that was an act of synthesis because, by the way, some of the people who were my RAs on that, Indrajit Roy, who's now professor at York and is doing all this brilliant work. He did this book on democracy. What was that? Reason for Audacity of Hope, I think, that did very well. So he was my RA on that. Bhrigupati Singh was my RA on that, who wrote this beautiful book on well-being. And so a lot of wonderful people worked on it with us. What we did in that book was to bring in this interdisciplinary literature and the quantitative literature and sort of say, what is the big picture here? And we found essentially that bottom-up stuff, a big message was that bottom-up stuff requires a sandwich. The top has to want the bottom to be better off, and therefore the top then protects the bottom from the local elites and are able to, counter that and implement better because of that process. And when that's done, it works well. What Jonathan Fox has called a sandwich. Now, the second thing we said, if you want to do this as the World Bank, these are the things you need to do to make all of this happen. And don't do it in place where you don't have top-down support on this. It'll be useless. I think we have affected policy a lot by that. Because that book, by the way, there's a bit of a digression on that. The president of the bank at that time, a fellow called Jim Kim, who, along with Paul Farmer, started Partners for Health and all that. And he thought he was a big participation advocate. So as soon as, and we're not against participation at all. Clearly, I'm not. This book, he hated because he felt we were attacking the participatory agenda. So he tried to censor it. First thing he did when he came to the bank was he tried to censor the book. He wanted literally all the copies that had been printed to be burnt.
Oh my God.
This is a man who's got a PhD in anthropology. Yeah. I mean, if you were not on a podcast, I'd use stronger language about him. But, he, such a horrible guy. And anthropologists without an anthropological sensibility, those exist too. Anyway, so that book, I think, is one of the things that I'm proudest of, in the sense that because it was an attempt at synthesizing a complicated literature in a way that was understandable to large numbers of people. It continues to be read, I think, because of that, because we tried very hard to write it reasonably simply. Sometimes you can't. The second thing is a book paper I've just finished with Sharan and M.R. Sharan and Siddharth George, which is a synthesis of the literature on panchayats. It's the same thing with 250,000 democracies, where we bring all of this together. And it's getting read. It's been downloaded more than 3,000 times in 2 weeks or so. Because we're trying to say that, look, there is something very, very interesting going on which there's a lot of good evidence that tells you how to fix it. Yeah? I'm really think that kind of work, I want to do more of it. Now, I think many disciplines are catching on to this. There's annual reviews in every discipline. They're trying to do that. At the end, I think there is still a challenge. At CFAR, I try very hard to push my colleagues to sort of do this more and more. And I find that they always struggle, and they're from all disciplines. They find it real struggle to communicate to a broader public, let alone other disciplines. That's slightly easier, but to the public, it's very hard for them. Some are better than others, but it's a different part of your brain you're trying to employ, and it's not just, but they know how to teach students, but that's not the same thing.
What I find a very difficult kind of thinking to do is a thinking where you don't just go along the lines of current research and try to take it forward in incremental ways, but sometimes you rethink what a concept means entirely. Like I was struck by this line in your Localizing Development, your book with Ghazala, where in the conclusion you wrote, quote, "The value of participation is clear. What is far less clear is whether participation can be induced through the type of large-scale government and donor-funded participatory programs that have become a leitmotif of development policy," stop quote. And the useful frame that I found in this book was the distinction between organic participation and induced participation. So, and that seems at the heart of, in fact, what organizations like the World Bank perhaps got wrong once. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think what can often happen is that you can have this lazy sense that once you have this notion that, yes, we should have participation, let's get it done like this, physics and we'll do it from the top down, etc., and you think your job is done, but actually you're just getting participation all wrong. And your book was like a cautionary, this thing that, no, we need to relook at what we mean by it. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
So if you look at successful participation, whether the American Civil Rights Movement or the Gandhian movement or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, they're all coming with a strongly perceived need to make the world different. But social movements, scholars talk about sort of imagining a better world and then figuring out how to get there, right? That act of imagination and the act of mobilization that follows that act of imagination is organic participation. It comes with leadership and it comes with mobilization. Leadership, both intellectual and actual practical leadership. And every great change that's happened on this planet to human beings has come because of that at the end. What the wrong logic that came from that in the bank and other places, not just the World Bank, every development organization was, and actually goes back to the Ford Foundation in the 50s. They see the Gandhian movement, we can make the Gandhian movement happen through policy. So that's induced participation. Right? We can make people into Gandhians. You can't. You need a Gandhi for that. The World Bank is not going to make it happen. In fact, all you can do is throw money at people, have them organize themselves into groups. You'll find the elite stealing all the money. That's basically what happens with these projects. So that was, I think, what we tried to show in that book, is that you're wasting your money when you could be doing something different. Now, all this other work, the work on panchayats, all of that is asking a slightly different question. How can we scale up organic participation? And the best example I know of this, which was partly involved with, is the livelihoods movement in India, the self-help group, SHGs, which is now broadly called the NRLM, the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. Now there's a National Urban Livelihoods Mission as well. What is the genesis of that? I'm writing about that right now with Paramita. Genesis of that, so let me digress a bit, if you don't mind.
Please.
Indulge me. You think about gender and gender issues in policy. And sorry to put it this way, but it's largely about, I don't know if anybody's going to listen to this, let me just say it, white people telling brown and black people what to do and how to be good women. So where the policymakers are coming from, of a Betty Friedan or, that crowd, the American feminists, the British feminists, the suffragists, all great people. But that's a particular view of what gender equality is. If you go to India, you have Savitribai Phule, you have Irabati Karve, you have a long tradition of Indian feminists who have developed an Indian notion of feminism that is kind of different from this kind of feminism. 1974, you have this beautiful Status Woman report produced by the government of India, Uma Chakravarti, others involved in writing it. I would recommend everybody reads it. Everybody read it. It may be old, but you read that darn thing. You talk about interdisciplinary writing, policy writing. It's a masterpiece. And you see why the kind of work that went in, passion that went in, full of ideas of how to make gender equality happen in India. Following from that, you have Mahala Samakhya, you have all the women's development programs, all of that starts coming. Of course, in parallel, you have organizations like SEWA doing what they do, Bangladesh BRAC and Grameen doing what they do. Grameen and BRAC slightly different trajectories, but SEWA very much along the Indian feminism. It's a Gandhian idea of feminism, if you wish. SEWA. Ela Ben, if you read her book, I mean, you see where she's coming from. She's an Indian feminist. She's clearly a feminist. Maybe not be the kind of feminist that would be recognizable to Hillary Clinton. I hope Hillary Clinton recognized. I should say that. I'm sure they know each other. They knew each other. But I don't want to be told, if I was an Indian woman, by somebody who doesn't understand my context, what my life should be like. The good thing about the NRLM and the livelihoods projects that started before that, those were Jivika in Bihar, Velugu in Andhra Pradesh. I have other problems with Velugu, but not this one. Kunabashri in Kerala, many, many projects. Is that they came from that Indian idea of feminism, which was what we need is collective action. Form women's collectives with the excuse of credit and savings, but that will just be a highway that we build to form women's collectives, and we'll roll out all kinds of things on top of them. And we're finishing a book now in Bihar showing, what a remarkable impact that's had on Bihar. I think it had an impact in many other places, but at least in Bihar we have the data now. Firstly, that this is an RCT we did with that in Bihar, Vivian Hoffman and a bunch of us, where in 2 years, Jivika was able to reduce, it had a huge impact on those who participated and they refinanced their debt from money lenders to the 24% interest rate, that much lower. Money lenders, 300% interest rate. But it reduced the money lenders' interest rates also because they were competing against this by 57%.
Wow.
That's a huge impact. And then other work subsequently has found that these women are now running more for office. They have much better ability to deal with risk and uncertainty. And all kinds of good stuff happens. That's just one study. There are many others, right? And the reason it happened is because it creates cultural and social capital for women in ways that work within that context. And that context is getting out of the caste patriarchy, the caste hierarchy patriarchal trap, and have them identify themselves as collectives of poor women. So that's a big transition they make via the project. And there are many, many things that they do to make that happen. To me, that's Indian feminism. Yeah. And I'm sure there is an equivalent, Tanzanian feminism and Mexican feminism. Yeah. And again, it goes back to this idea of reflexivity. If you're going to look at gender, and importantly, with all these NRLM projects, they're trained, the facilitators are trained to not confront men, but to incorporate them, to make them part of the process. And in fact, we see in our book, the criticism they got was Nitish has become a woman, Nitish Kumar, because it's his project. Yeah. So, but that support from the chief minister downward, again, the sandwich, helps the bottom-up process happen. So that to me is an example of an organic process scaling up, which is the way it should happen. Not, hey, this livelihoods project worked in, God knows, Indonesia, let's bring it to India. No. Yeah. What is the Indian version of this? And you can do an Indonesian version. What's unfortunately happening with livelihoods project a little bit, they're taking the Indian SHG thing and importing into other countries, which is going to have the same effect. Yeah. It's not dealing with the context well enough.
Shruti Rajgopalan and Alex Tabarrok had this great paper on premature imitation as public policy. The concept of isomorphic mimicry. If it worked there, it must work here. Let's bring it here. No nuance, etc., etc.
That concept actually goes back to Peter Evans, the sociologist. Yeah, it's a wonderful idea. And then, of course, Lant and Michael Woolcock have written on that as well.
Yeah. So is it, in a sense, inevitable that the greater the distance that you have from the ground, both in terms of actual geographical distance and in terms of size, that you are likely to miss the wood for the trees? In the sense, I would imagine for a big multilateral organization, it is actually natural to think in simplistic terms because that's the only way to actually, grok what's in front of you, the deep complexity of it. And it is natural to have that kind of paternalistic attitude. And the incentive towards self-correction may not be that high because you are also getting your funding from somewhere. You have to show your funders that you're making interventions, that you're making a difference. How you make a difference could also come from how you gather your data and what your metrics are. And it can just become, like you put it, it can just become a game and it can become a bit of a problem.
There's a natural equilibrium. Absolutely, that's along those lines. The same point you were making earlier about becoming an engineer or a doctor. It's the natural equilibrium. I think it can be corrected. And that's what Jim Wolfenson tried to do, to his credit. Because of the force of his personality, Jim Wolfenson was a kind of a character. He he was one of the rudest, most arrogant men I've ever worked with. But I think that arrogance and that so on was in his actions. I mean, in the way he talked to people. In his thinking, he was not. He was very reflexive. So he used that to make change happen, And what he did was basically say 3 or 4 different things. As I said, every World Bank staff has to spend a week in the field, living with a poor family and figuring out what life really is that they're trying to fix. Secondly, we're going to, when we sort of start developing policies for countries, we're going to have a participatory process of discussing those policies with large groups of people, see what civil society says, conversations with civil society. Thirdly, people are going to be rewarded for doing this kind of work. Even if they don't deliver necessarily, they're going to be rewarded for the process. Yeah, it's not necessarily always going to work that way. It doesn't work that way, but that's what the principles I'm going to hire people who think in this way. Yeah, and I think it did make a difference, and that he changed the World Bank because now it's all going back to form in many ways for many reasons, and we're ending up, becoming rather than a multilateral development agency, a multilateral corporation. I think that's also happening. Because of these imperatives, the need for speed, the need, everybody saying, where is the change happen? Change doesn't happen quickly, boss. Change takes time. If you don't understand that, go run a corporation. Because you can do that there. You cannot do it in these places, So that thinking has to change, and it's going to come back. I mean, so I think...
Is it changing? I mean, you're in the World Bank. Do things move in the right direction? And I'm sure you're not the only one there who feels this way.
They have... Look, I've been at the World Bank 25 years, which is not 80 years. I've been there 25 years. I think the Wolfensohn Bank was the best bank that I have personally seen because of attention to these things. It wasn't necessarily successful. In fact, localizing development was a critique of the Wolfensohn Bank in many ways because they spent so much money on this community development. But I think all of those imperatives, which is basically slow cooking, at the end, we're looking at the difference of slow cooking and McDonald's versus some beautiful restaurant, right? That slow cooking process, people are having less and less patience for. And everybody wants results yesterday. Everybody wants to disperse money as fast as possible. That need for disbursement results in, at the end, misguided policy because you're not doing any checking. You're not doing checks and balances. You're just pushing money out the door. That is increasingly happening, I think, more than it did when I joined. And, I think my views are shared by a lot of people. They may not have the willingness to express them. I think there's something more fundamental going on. Talking about development, let me digress a bit into that. And I think, when I started out in this field, it was essentially the global north supporting development in the global south. The money came from one direction to the other. That has completely changed now. Between China, India, other countries, there's a fair amount of money in the global south that they can fund their own work. In fact, India has now banned all NGOs from operating, as we know. So the places like the World Bank or even the bilaterals, even worse, FCDO in Britain, the Scandinavians, they all have to shift how they do this kind of work, right? So everybody's trying to navigate in this new world. And I think part of that is to sort of, I don't know how that's all going to settle in. But the world of development, I think, needs to change in the following way. That development is not a global south issue. It is basically the field of how we make people better off, period, in every sense of the word. In other words, places like the World Bank should be advising everybody, and providing funding where necessary for everybody. It should be much more open, like it was when it first started after World War II.
So moving on to broader questions, what are the big questions that you feel more people should be focusing on but aren't yet including in this field? And B, that mean a lot to you personally and that you want to spend time tackling. You've already spoken about deliberative democracy and the structures of, what enables that. But what are the big questions we should all be thinking about in your view?
I mean, the two big questions, and they're very, I think it's not just my view, they're broadly recognized as backwards. How do we heal a broken world? In other words, how do we improve process of collective action? It's another way of phrasing that, which is all the work that I was talking about earlier. The second one is like Game of Thrones, climate change. It's descending on us. It's already descending. It's there. How are we going to function? What are we going to do? So these are very obvious things. The approaches to them, I think, can be done a little bit differently. And there's actually a third thing, which is the fact that machines are getting so bloody good at what they do, and they're going to get better and better and better. Which means that not only will we have paternalism, we'll have machinism. I don't know what that word, what the equivalent is. Machines will be ruling us, not benevolent dictators. How do we make all of that more reflexive? How we make? And I think it's going to work better if it's more reflexive for us as human beings. So my little part of that is to try to think about deliberative democracy and collective action. But all of these are such bigger fields than that. So I think some of the work I was talking about with narrative well-being and with trying to make qualitative analysis scaled up using natural language processing tools and those methods we're trying to develop is one attempt at that. But I think there's got to be much, much more than that, and people are doing that kind of work. The part that I think know less about, and I wish I knew more about, was climate change. A bunch of us in Nepal have been we conducted 100 interviews divided equally, small sample, but we hope this is going to be scaled up in all three parts of Nepal, which is the mountains, the hills, and the valleys, and the plains. And as I said, those narratives are revealing the kind of struggles people are going through dealing with this stuff. They're saying that their livestock, all kinds of strange new diseases, of course, human diseases, uncertainty about when to crop, when not to crop, and basic stuff like they get trapped by landslides. And then in the very high hills, they find some good impacts. There's more of a growing season. So all kinds of stuff that we don't quite know. So we have to be, in my world, we have to get a lot better at listening to the bottom on the impact of climate change so we can address those questions of resilience better. Yeah. Mitigation is a whole different story. That's much more global, and that's other people who know much more than me on that. But I think we're going to have a tough few decades,
If there's a young scholar listening to this right now, or someone inclined towards scholarship, and they're thinking this is a great field, I should get into it, maybe they're already in it, they recognize what you say about the incentives of the academic world or the incentives in organizations such as this, but they are thinking that, hey, that can get me a good life, I also need to have a good career, etc., and yet they care about knowledge. So what would your advice to them be in terms of how should they think in terms of their path? What mistakes should they not make, which you might have made or other young people might have made, that one can learn from? And, what area should they focus on?
Yeah. Let me start with scholarship, because I think I know a little bit more about that. As we discussed earlier, you should have a passion for it first. There should have the passion for the intellectual life, and I think for the life of the intersection between intellectual life and practical life. If you have that passion, and you have a passion for amongst these subjects, it doesn't matter which field you're in. I think these three big questions are where you should be, broadly. If you're going to go in that direction, my little bit on that would be, please try to bring in as much of the bottom as you can with it. But don't be discriminatory as to discipline. Don't be discriminatory as to method. All methods are useful. All disciplines are useful. Computers, yes, they might take over the world. They also give us all these tremendous tools, whether they're LLMs or whatever else. How do we bring that into the service of reflexivity, in the service of people? And it's not just people. It's all living things. It's not just people, right? It's animals, it's plants. It's an ecosystem, right? How do we bring that systems approach to make it more reflexive, to make it matter in ways that don't presuppose that you as the researcher are much smarter than those you're trying to help, as it were. Yeah. And I think increasingly, one of the things I'm finding very fascinating, I've seen those YouTube videos of dogs talking because they can press buttons through AI, So I think that's not a joke. I think soon we're going to be in Dr. Doolittle's world. Yeah, we'll be able to understand animals and fish and everybody else much better than we can. We're already doing it with crows and dogs. So then that starts going to start mattering. And how do we bring all those views in? What is animal welfare? They already have a friend, Burke Osler, thinking about these things as do others. So it's going to be a fascinating world of scholarship out there, practical scholarship. How do we meld that into practice? I think that's where there's got to be a collaboration between, and practitioners have to stop seeing scholars with disdain. Scholars have to start not seeing practice as something that they don't know how to do or they don't know how to talk to. That intersection has to be better. in my little world, I hope the World Bank Research Department survives and strengthens, because it actually gives you an opportunity to embed a research department in this crazy, big, mad organization that is supposed to be doing good. Yeah. If you have researchers inside that, it really helps, rather than importing them from academia, which is, what people think will be a solution to this. It won't, because the academics have very different incentives. So, I think that being completely obsessed with a disciplinary career is going to be less necessary and less valuable in some ways. I mean, I hope that also changes. What I find, unfortunately, is, I try to do as much of this as I can, and I just have so much time. People don't have access to people they can seek advice from, one-on-one counseling on these things. As I said, I was very lucky in the world I lived in. I think all of us should be trying to do more of that. If a young person is looking for direction, try to find the time for them. When I leave my World Bank job, when I retire, want to do a little bit more of that. But I hope others, and many people try. Academics do it naturally because they do it with their students. But all of us should be trying to do more of that. And I think how we do it, I noticed that you were doing it in DC. I'm sure you do it in other places. You talk to young people. That's, for us as the older generation, I think is really necessary and important, because people are directionless, and that's part of the challenge. It's just that part of that also is, I think, it's a consequence of a good thing, which is social mobility. Folks are coming from very different backgrounds and are able now to have these opportunities, but don't have direction. So we have to help that process. So I don't know if that answers your question, and I don't know if this.
They're very wise words. It absolutely answers my question. For my third last question, see how organized I am. For my third last question, I'm actually going to ask you to turn inwards and answer a question that you almost asked yourself earlier in the show. What makes a good life?
Oh boy. I've actually not thought about that for myself, which is interesting. So give me a minute. Sure. I think for me, the first point is that the notion of a good life changes constantly. It's not one thing. At every point in life, where this Buddhist notion of constant change, I think we have to take that very seriously for all of us. That we have to be in a process of constant assessment and reassessment, because we all grow. Sorry, I don't think we all grow, but circumstances change. Second, a good life requires you to reflect upon yourself and to learn constantly. We are frail creatures. We are very vulnerable creatures. We are creatures full of failings. And we are in a network of other failed individuals and people full of failures, good things and bad things. So in this network of neuroses, if you wish, right? Mm. And things are constantly changing everywhere all the time. Everybody's going through their own process. If you lack the capacity to reflect and to see your own life and the lives of others, and not judge, but adjust, I don't think you will have a good life. Because otherwise you'll be stuck with the notion of what matters, and you will constantly see yourself as a failure. Let me just give you a simple example of that in my field of economics. Constantly, and I would say once in 2 years, you hear of a very prominent economist who's committed suicide. Usually around the time of the Nobel Prize.
Oh, wow.
It's a mad thing.
I didn't know that. My God.
Yes. Yeah. The sense that there's only one way. I mean, you're stuck in this thing. And the two examples I'm thinking of are both very, very successful, famous economists. And yes, depression matters. Many of us are depressed people, right? But the idea that you think it's so overwhelming that you're going to kill yourself, that comes from a sense of who you think you should be, which I think is a huge problem. If we stick with that notion in our heads, and that happens across social classes, I talked about in the field of these kids who got some BA degree from some college in the district headquarters and feel they're superior to everybody else in the village, and then get depressed and they have miserable lives. If they simply said, okay, this is my opportunity set, I'm going to make the best of this, they'll be better off. So I think the ability to constantly reflect and adjust at every stage is central to a good life.
Would it be fair to say then that a good life is not a state but a process of just thinking about yourself, adjusting to the reality of the world and
Absolutely.
so on?
I think that's exactly what a good life is, a process. I think if I've talked about anything in our few hours together, it's been about process. And I think whether it's policy or your own life, it's process. And to think entirely of outcomes and to judge people with outcomes and to judge yourself with outcomes of how high on the pecking order are you, that is endemic to our fellow subcontinentals, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, I don't care who you are, you're all the same way. I wish the Indian obsession with some magical growth number that's going to make us $1 trillion economy, all of this is part of that thinking. Instead, worry about how do we make people better off. It's not just money. Money matters. No question that growth matters. I'm not saying putting down all of that. But to judge yourself on that basis, rather than on how the average person is better off, whatever that better off is that we've talked about, we can complicate that notion. I think, and then it results also in this business of I'm better than you, therefore my religion is better than your religion, my way of being is better than your way of being. All of that follows from that. It all follows from not thinking of process and of change as being central.
All of that is so toxic and a road to unhappiness. Really wise words. So my penultimate question to you is really the final question for most of my other guests, but I have something else for you which I will unleash upon you. But the penultimate question is this. For me and my listeners, recommend to us books, movies, music that you love so much, just pure love that you want to share with everyone.
Oh boy, that's really hard. Music, I would say follow me on Twitter because I constantly post music.
Yeah.
And this is all music that I think is just extraordinary. There's a treasure trove of Hindustani classical, Carnatic classical music now available. All these precious private recordings have become public. It's mad what's out there. So filtering through that, I think is really useful. We can talk about music in a bit. I'll come back to it. But in terms of books, your podcast introduced me to Arti Kumar Rao's Margin Lands. I was blown away with that. I just thought it was almost. I'm already blown away by work along those lines. Amitabh Ghosh, so on. This is reflexive work because I think that's why it appeals to me so much, and it's so beautifully written and beautifully photographed and illustrated. Boy, so I always think of the last book I read, right? And so going back further from that. I'm going to say something that other people you've interviewed are not going to say. I'm saying the Bhagavad Gita. Read it. Read it carefully without anybody else's interpretation but your own. And find a translation. You can read Gandhiji's translation. There's so many translations out there. That is such a font of wisdom. It's extraordinary. It's as we know, a distillation of Upanishads. Don't read all the Upanishads. Read that one. Yeah. Read Gandhiji again. Read Story of My Experiments. Don't judge him because he was of his time and he evolved as a person. Just read it for what it is. Yeah. These are books that shape me, so that's what I'm saying. Read the Bible, read the Quran. All books have a lot of wisdom in them. You may agree with some stuff, you may not agree with some stuff. To me, one of the biographies that I really, really loved, and unfortunately, I'm sometimes very bad with authors' names. There's a professor at University at Edinburgh who wrote a biography of Adam Smith. And this man, what a guy. Right? And what a thinker. And the fact that he was ahead of his time in interdisciplinarity and in bringing philosophy and economics together in all these interesting ways. I think, oh God, you've really got me. Does everybody get stuck like this in this question?
Well, some people come prepared because I'm going to ask.
I wasn't prepared. I should have. In terms of movies, look.
The biography you were referring to, was it Adam Smith, An Enlightened Life? Nicholas Phillipson, yeah.
So I just love that. There is I think going back and reading in economics, the work of Elinor Ostrom, in philosophy and in political philosophy, reading the work of Jane Mansbridge, both on collective action and deliberation. In Albert Hirschman, I should not just Exit, Voice and Loyalty, anything he's written is tremendously illuminating. I can go on and on, so I'm going to stop with that. I read a lot of history, so I suppose all of that, that whole world that's out there, so much. in terms of movies, if you haven't seen the Lawrence of Arabia on the big screen, you've missed a huge opportunity. If it ever shows on a 70mm screen, drop everything, go see it. Have you done that?
I have seen it on video, basically television, not on a big screen as a kid.
Not the same thing. To see it on 70mm with that sound, the whole thing starts with an overture and then it goes into. It's the grandest movie ever made. Mughal-e-Azam, big screen, similarly. In fact, I like the colorized version better. Oh man, I loved Samskara, Girish Karnad's Samskara. I just loved that movie.
You knew him also?
I can't say I knew him. I knew him as a child, which is not the same thing as knowing him, right? I didn't know him as an adult at all. He knew my aunt, obviously, very well. Wow. I think increasingly we have to go to TV series rather than movies. So there's so many.
The ethnographer in you would love The Wire because
The Wire is mine and everybody else's favorite TV show of all time. Deadwood is a Western version of The Wire, I think. So that's worth watching. I'll tell you a TV series I don't like, which is Panchayat. And I'll tell you why I don't like it. There was I told Shruti this as well, so I'm going to repeat that story here. I was once in Bangalore at a party, and I met this old Jewish lady. She must have been close to 90. And she had grown up somewhere in Poland or something and ended up in India, divorced her husband, married a Mysorean guy and settled in and all of that. She had this interesting life. She was escaping the Holocaust. So I asked her, have you read Vikram Seth's Two Lives? She said, I started it, but I didn't like it at all. Why? My life is much more interesting. So that's about, his uncle who marries a Holocaust survivor. I feel the same about panchayats, in the sense that it's too trite. The panchayat life is far more interesting than that.
It's anodyne.
It's anodyne, and it's a cute story, but I don't enjoy it. Music is a category I think I can spend a little more time on.
Please.
And I'm going to stick with classical music because that's, I think, what I know best. Indian classical music. In Hindustani music, forgive me, because I'm going to be a stupid old man. It gets worse with every generation. Right? And the current Instagram generation is the worst of the lot because they're also, if you watch them, they're auto-tuning their sur, it's terrible. And they seem to highlight this, what I call machine gun classicism, which is this, your ability to say your tans as fast as possible rather than with in interesting things. The logic of the bharat, of the process by which you expound on the music disappears. But going back to Ustad Fayaz Khan, Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, Mallikarjun Mansoor, to me, is the greatest. The senior Daga brothers, Kesar Bhai Kerkar, of course Pandit Bhimsen Joshi, Kumar Gandharva, can't escape him. One of the most brilliant in minds. Forget his singing, the mind was so brilliant. People look down on, there's this Ravi Shankar Vilayat Khan debate that's really idiotic. They're both great, amazing sitar players, in very different in what they do. Ravi Shankar's ability to construct haikus, within 10 minutes, he'll show you what a rag can do. That's extraordinary. And Vilayat Khan's craziness, his romantic craziness is different. So they're both worth listening to. Ali Akbar Khan Sahib, of course, and the Jugalbandis Ali Akbar Khan Sahib has had both with Ravi Shankar and Vilayat Khan are worth it. Bismillah Khan Sahib. Oh my God. There are, great tabla players. Ahmedjan Thirkwa. Of course, Ustad Lara Khan and his son, Zakir Hussain. And my friends, their sons, Fazal Qureshi. Going in that direction, let's go in the Thumri direction. Shobha Gurtu, the older Girija Devi, she lost it a little bit as she grew older. Forgive me. N. Rajam is, to me, she deserves the Bharat Ratna. Her violin really makes you want to, and of course her guru, Omkar Nath Thakur. It's just amazing music. Mogubai Kurdikar and Kishori Amankar, both mother and daughter, are extraordinary musicians in their own life.
I thought you weren't allowed to listen to Kishori.
I do now. My Guruji is passed, so I can do what I want. And I listen to... I like... So there's a Arun Dravid, who is her senior shishya. He started gathering the older Kishori recordings. So those are much more, my guru would be very happy listening to them because they're much more in the old Jaipur Troli style. Oh my God. And Carnatic music, which I should mention because I listen to it a lot, even though, as I said, I know less. The magical thing about Carnatic music is it is such a different style. It is so close to the composition and then elaborating on that composition. And there the younger musicians are extraordinary as the older ones. Madurai Mani Iyer, M.S. Subbulakshmi, M.D. Ramanathan is the grandest, the greatest of them all, in my view. Any time he opens his mouth, it's like you're watching God sing. He's, to me, he and Amir Khan Sahib, these two are, they're Carnatic and Hindustani equivalents. In the modern generation, T.M. Krishna can give you a profoundly fantastic performance. Sanjay Subramaniam, Aruna Sairam, and T.R. Mahalingam, the flutist in that older generation, T.N. Krishnan, who's the brother of N. Rajam, and they're Jugalbandis. There's a beautiful recording, I might post it on Twitter one of these days, where they're performing Hamsadhvani in the Hindustani and Carnatic style. And of course, Rajam was trained as a Carnatic musician to begin with, he knows it really well. Yes, so I'll stop there, but I continue. But to me, focusing on the percussion, I studied Mridangam in Rishi Valley for 4 years with Krishna Iyer, who was the student of Palghat Mani Iyer. And listening to Palghat Mani Iyer play the Mridangam is another crazy experience. And another one's Umayapulam Shivaraman is another great... anyway, so lots of... It takes a lifetime to go through all of that. And so many of their recordings are now available on YouTube.
I'll link all these guys from the show notes, but to make it easier for my listeners and me, I'll also request you to send 10, 20 links, as many as you feel like, to particular performances. Absolutely. So that, we can kind of sink into all of this.
Happy to do that.
Great. So my last question is not really a question, it's a request. But I would like you to say yes to the request before you know what it is. Are you willing to trust me and do that? Come.
Chalo, theek hai, yes. What is it?
Okay, I'd like you to sing for me.
Oh my God, yaar. After talking for so long.
Drink some water. I can get you some more water if you wish.
I'll do it for you.
Thank you.
But with the caveat that you'll edit that part out if I don't like it. Is that okay?
Yes. Like I said, anything that you say that you want me to cut, I'll cut. But I didn't say anything that you sing. But okay, I will. I accept.
I'm not in full practice.
No, done. I agree.
But thankfully, I have a Tanpura on my phone. So the thing with Jaipur Troli is that it's very much based on the composition. It follows from the composition. And the idea is within that avartan, within those whatever 10, 16 beats, whatever the tal is, you're supposed to express whatever you want to say. And you have to land on the sum. You cannot go beyond those. And you improvise within that. You don't improvise at alap. So there's no alap without rhythm. Everything starts with the rhythm. The alap comes within the rhythmic structure. So that's the big difference. The second thing is the genius of Aladia Khan Sahib, who invented the Jaipur Troli Gharana, is that he kept making jodrags that were crazy. One jodrag that I love, which maybe I'll sing that a little bit, is called Basanti Kedar, which is a mix of Rag Basant and Rag Kedar. So I don't know. Let me give you a little bit of flavor of Kedar and Basant if I can, and then I'll plunge into Basanti Kedar. This is Rag Kedar and so many songs. So film songs. Darshan do ghan shyam nath more akhiyan pyase re. That's Rag Kedar. Let's take Rag Basant. Let me switch ragas here. Basant again. I'll sing the one I like, which is a Ashtapati Git Govinda Jayadeva's, which is the original composition is by Raghunath Panagri, but I made it from Odia style into Hindustani. So the thing with Basant is a Uttara Pralang rag, so you're singing at the upper reaches. Na, ललितलवङ्गलता परिशीलन कोमलमलय समीर तामनुसर सरसीरुहलोचन माधव हरति विषादं. Yeah, that's Rag Basant. Now you see how Aladia Khan brings them together in Basanti Kedar. अतर सुगंध गुलाब नवेलनिया चहूँ दिशा फूल रही गलियाँ डालनिया अतर सुगंध गुलाब लनिया तरसु गंध तरसु तरसु गंध Su Gang So Gan.
Absolutely beautiful. Such magic. Thank you so much for doing this. If people at the World Bank ever say, Biju, you got to come in line now. You got to sing for your supper. You can sing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amit. That was wonderful. Exhausting, but wonderful. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, share it with anyone you think might be interested. I think the ideas we discussed in this are super important. Check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. A lot of Biju's work is linked there. You can follow Biju on Twitter at Biju Rao, that's one word. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITBARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.